Chapter 22 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Rome. The crisis passed, as all such must pass, and Alex found herself in the position openly recognised as that of waiting for the dissolution of her religious vows. It was, as Father Farrell had said, neither a short nor an easy business, nor was she allowed to pass the months of her waiting at the Liège mother house. They sent her to a small house in the Order in Rome, thinking, with the curious convent instinct for misplaced economy, to save the petty cost of incessant passing to and fro of correspondence and documents between the convent in Belgium and the Papal Secretariat at the Vatican. Alex went to Italy in a dream. It struck her with a faint sense of irony that she and Barbara long ago had entertained an ambition to visit Italy, standing for all that was romantic and picturesque in the South. After all, she was to be the first to realize that girlish dream, the fulfilment of which brought no elation. At first she lived amongst the nuns and led their life, but when it became evident beyond question that she was eventually to obtain release from her vows, the community held no place for her any longer. Her religious habit was taken away, and a thick, voluminous black stuff dress substituted, which the nuns thought light and cool in comparison with their own weighty garments, but of which the hard, stiff cuffs and high collar, unrelieved by any softening of white, made Alex suffer greatly. The house was too small to admit of a pensionnat, but the nuns took in an inconsiderable number of lady boarders and an occasional pupil. Alex, however, was not suffered to hold any intercourse with these. After her 6 months spent in community life, a final appeal was made to her, and when it failed of its effect, she passed into a kind of moral ostracism. She had a small bedroom, where her meals were served by the lay sister who waited on the lady boarders, and a little prie-dieu was put in a remote corner of the chapel for her use, neither to be confounded with the choir stalls, nor the benches for visitors, nor the seats reserved for the ladies living in the house. The librarian's sister, in charge of the well-filled bookcase of the community rooms, had instructions to provide her with literature. Beyond that, her existence remained unrecognized. She often spent hours doing nothing, gazing from the window at the Corso far below, so curiously instinct with life after the solitude of the Liège grounds, encompassed by high walls on every side. She did not read very much. The books they gave her were all designed to one end, that of making her realize that she was turning her back upon the way of salvation. When she thought about it, Alex believed that this was in truth what she was doing, but it hardly seemed to matter. Her room was fireless, and the old-fashioned house, as most Roman ones, had no form of central heating. She shivered, and in the early days of February fell ill. One abscess after another formed inside her throat, an unspeakably painful manifestation of general weakness. One evening she was so ill that there was talk of sending for the chaplain. The doctor had never been suggested. But that same night the worst abscess of all broke inside her throat, and Alex saw that there was no hope of her being about to die. The bright winter cold seemed to change with incredible rapidity into glowing summer heat, and a modicum of well-being gradually returned to her. She even crept slowly and listlessly about in the shade of the great Borghese gardens, in the comparative freshness of the Pincio height, and wondered piteously at this strange realization of her girlhood's dream of seeing Italy. She never dared to go into the streets alone, nor would the nuns have permitted it. Her difficult letters to England had been written. Cedric had replied with courteous brevity, a letter so much what Sir Francis might have written that Alex was almost startled, and her father's man of business had written her a short, kind little note, rejoicing that the world was again to have the benefit of Miss Clare's society after her temporary retirement. The only long letter she received was from Barbara. Hampstead, March 30th, 1908. Dearest Alex, your letter from Rome was of course a great surprise. I had been wondering when I should hear from you again, but I did not at all guess what your news would be when it came, as we had all quite grown to think of you as completely settled in the convent. I am afraid that, as you say, there may be complications and difficulties about your vows, as I suppose they are binding to a certain extent, and they are sure not to let you off without a fuss. Your letters aren't very explicit, my dear, so I'm still somewhat in the dark as to what you are doing and when you mean to come to London, as I suppose you will eventually do. And why Italy? If you're going to get out of the whole thing altogether, it seems funny that the convent people should trouble to send you to Italy, when you might just as well have come straight to England. However, no doubt you know your own affairs best, Alex dear, and perhaps you're wise to take advantage of an opportunity that may not come again. Travelling has always been my dream, as you know, but except for that time I had at Neuilly when you came out, heavens, what ages ago, and then our honeymoon in Paris, which was so terribly broken into when dear mother died, I've never had any chance at all, and I suppose now I never shall have. Everything is so expensive, and I'm really not a very good traveller unless I can afford to do the thing comfortably. Otherwise I should simply love to have run over to Rome for Easter and got you to show me all the sights. I suppose your time is quite your own now? Of course, when you really do leave the sisters, I hope you'll come straight to my wee cottage here, at any rate while you look about you and think over future plans. Cedric has written to you, I know, and if you feel you'd rather go to Clevedon Square, needless to say, my dear, I shall more than understand. Please yourself absolutely. But of course one's always rather chary of unknown sisters-in-law, and Violet quite rules the roost nowadays. She and Cedric are a most devoted couple, and all that sort of thing, but as she's got all the money, one rather feels as if it was her house. I dare say you know the kind of thing I mean. She's quite a dear in many ways, but I don't go there tremendously. Pamela adores her and lives in her pocket. Pam tells me she hasn't seen you since she was about 15. I could hardly believe it. My dear, I don't know what you'll think of her. She's quite appallingly modern to my mind, and makes me feel about 100 years old. When I think of the way we were chaperoned and sent about everywhere with a maid, and only allowed the dullest of dinner parties and tea parties, and then those stiff, solemn balls. Pamela is for ever being asked to boy and girl affairs and dinner dances and theatre parties. I must say she's a huge success. Everyone raves about her, and she goes in for being tremendously natural and jolly and full of vitality, and she's had simply heaps of chances already, though I dare say some of it has to do with being seen about everywhere with Violet, who simply splashes money out like water. She paid all Archie's debts, poor boy, I will say that for her. The result is that he's quite good and steady now, and everyone says he'll make a first-rate guardsman. I'm writing a long screed, Alex, but I really feel you ought to be posted up in all the family news, if you're really going to come and join forces with us again after all these years. It seems quite funny to think of. So many things have happened since you left home for good, as we thought it was going to be. Do write again and tell me what you think of doing and when you're coming over. My tiny spare room will be quite ready for you any time you like. Your loving sister, Barbara McAllister. Barbara's letter was astounding. Even Alex, too jaded for any great poignancy of emotion, felt amazement at her sister's matter-of-fact acceptance of a state of affairs that had been brought about by such moral and physical upheaval. Had Barbara realized none of it, or was she merely utterly incurious? Alex could only feel thankful that no long explanatory letter need be written. Perhaps when she got back to England it would be easier to make her explanation to Barbara. She could hardly imagine that return. The affair of the release from her vows dragged on with wearisome indefiniteness. Documents and papers were sent for her signature, and there were 1 or 2 interviews, painful and humiliating enough. None of them, however, hurt her as that interview in the parlour at Liège with Father Farrell had done, for to none of them did she bring that faint shred of hope that had underlain her last attempt to make clear the truth as she knew it. She knew that money had been paid, and Cedric had written a grave and short note, bidding her leave that side of the question to his care and to that of her father's lawyers. Then, with dramatic unexpectedness, came the end. She was told that all the necessary formalities had been complied with, and that her vows were now annulled. It was carefully explained to her that this did not include freedom to marry. The Church would sanction no union of hers. Alex could have laughed. She felt as though marriage had been spoken of, for the first time, to an old, old woman who had never known love, and to whom passion and desire alike had long been as strangers. Why should that, which had never come to her eager, questing youth, be spoken of in connection with the strange, remote self which was all that was left of her now? She reflected how transitory had been the relations into which she had entered, how little any intimacy of spirit had ever bound her to another human being. Her first love, Marie-Angèle. I love you for your few caresses. I love you for my many tears. Where was Marie-Angèle now? Alex knew nothing of her. No doubt she had married, had borne children, and somewhere in her native Soissons was gay and prosperous still. Alex dimly hoped so. Queenie Torrance. Her thoughts even now dwelt tenderly for a moment on that fair, irresponsive object of so much devotion. On Queenie as a pale, demure schoolgirl, her fair curls rolled back from her white, open brow, in her black stuff dress and apron. On Queenie, the blue ribbon for good conduct lying across her gently curving breast, serenely telling fibs or surreptitiously carrying off the forbidden sweets and dainties procured for her by Alex, or gazing with cold vexation on some extravagant demonstration of affection that had failed to win her approval. In retrospect, Alex could see Queenie again, the white voluminous ball dresses she had worn, the tiny wreath of blue forget-me-nots, once condemned as bad form by Lady Isabel. On Queenie Goldstein her thoughts dwelt little. She had heard long ago from Barbara of Queenie's divorce, in an action brought by her husband, which had afforded the chief scandal of the year 1899, and then no one had heard or even seen anything of Queenie for a long while, and Barbara had said that she was reported to be abroad with her father. 5 years later Barbara had written excitedly: "You remember that awful Queenie Goldstein, and how full the papers were of her pictures when that dreadful divorce case of hers was on, and the 5 correspondents and everything? You'll hardly believe it, but she's in London again, having succeeded in marrying an American whom every one says is the coming millionaire. I saw her at the theatre myself in a box absolutely slung with diamonds. She's taken to making up her face tremendously, but she hasn't altered much, and she's received everywhere. They say her husband simply adores her." Alex still remembered the rebuke with which Mother Gertrude had handed her that letter, bidding her remind her sister that things of the world, worldly, had no place in the life of a nun. Nevertheless, although she had put the thought from her, she knew that in her heart she had felt a certain gladness that her erstwhile playmate, given over though she might be to the world, the flesh and the devil, had yet not found those things that she coveted to have failed her. Queenie, at least, had known what she wanted, and Alex's thoughts of her held no condemnation. From Queenie her mind went to the memory of Noel Cardew, and she was faintly surprised at the unvivid presentment of him which was all that she could evoke. Noel had held no real place in her life at all. Nothing that would endure had ever passed between him and her. It was years since she had thought of their ill-starred engagement, and then it had always been in connection with Sir Francis and Lady Isabel, their brief pride and pleasure in it, and the sudden downfall of their hopes. Of Noel himself she had scarcely a recollection. Perhaps her clearest one was that of the earnest young egoist, only made attractive by a certain simplicity, who had taken her to sit in a disused ice-house one hot summer day, and had talked about photography. Of the later Noel, Alex was astounded to find that she retained no impression at all. She could not even remember whether it was he or his brother Eric who had married red-haired Marie Munroe in the same year that she herself had taken her first vows as a nun. Perhaps it was Noel. At all events, he had probably married long ago, and Alex could believe that some corner of land in Devonshire was the better for the earnest supervision that he would accord to it, both in his own person and in that of the generation that would doubtless succeed him. Mother Gertrude. At the last and most worshipped of the shrines before which Alex had offered the sad, futile, unmeasured burnt offerings of her life, her thoughts lingered least. It had all been a mistake. She had given recklessly, foolishly, squandering her all because life had cheated her of any outlet for a force of the strength of which she had had no measure given her. And now she had to pay the bitter penalty for a folly which had not even been met by answering human affection. She wrote no letter to Mother Gertrude and received no word from her. As the days crept on, Alex, without volition of her own, found that her journey to England had been arranged for, that money was to be advanced to her for her expenses, that she was expected to supplement with it her utter penury of worldly possessions. One day she went out, frightened and at a loss, and entered some of the first shops she saw, in a street that led down from the Pincio gates. They were not large shops, and she had difficulty in making herself understood, but she purchased a ready-made blue serge skirt, with a coat that she called a jacket, and an ugly black toque that most resembled in shape those that she remembered seeing in London 10 years earlier. She wore these clothes, with a white cotton blouse that fastened at the back and came high up under her chin, for some days before she left Rome, so as to grow accustomed to them, and to lose the sense of awkwardness that they produced in her. The heavy boots and a pair of black cotton gloves that she had brought from Belgium still served her. The day of her departure was fixed, and she wrote to Barbara, but she knew neither by what route she was going nor how long the journey would take. Her companions, selected by the Superior of the convent, proved to be an old lady and her daughter who were going to Paris. Evidently they knew her story, for they looked at her with scared, curious faces, and spoke to her very little. Both were experienced travellers, and on the long, hot journey in the train, when it seemed as though the seats of the railway carriage were made of molten iron, they extended themselves with cushions and little paper fans, and slept most of the way. At Genoa, the daughter, timidly but with kindness, pressed Alex to eat and drink, and after that she spoke to her once or twice, and gave her a friendly invitation to join them at the small pension in Paris to which they were bound, for a night's halt before she proceeded to Boulogne, and thence to England. Alex accepted with bewildered thankfulness. She was weak and exhausted, and the old lady and her daughter were pitiful enough, and saw her into the train next day, and gave her the provision of sandwiches which she had not thought to make for herself. The train sped through flat, green country, with tall poplars shading the small, narrow French houses that dotted the line on either side. Her eye dilated as she gazed on the sea when at last Boulogne was reached. She remembered the same grey expanse of rolling waves tipped with foam on the morning 8 years ago, when the girl Alex Clare had crossed to Belgium, tearful indeed and frightened, but believing herself to be making that new beginning which should lead to the eventual goal which life must surely hold in store for her. Only 8 years, and the bitterness of a lifetime's failure encompassed her spirit. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. N.W. Alex got off the boat at Folkestone dazed and bewildered. She had been ill all through the crossing, and her head was still swimming. She grasped her heavy, clumsy suitcase and was thankful to have no luggage when she saw the seething crowd of passengers running after uniformed porters in search of heavy baggage that was being flung onto trucks to an accompaniment of noise and shouting that frightened her. She made her way to the train and into a third-class carriage, too much afraid of it starting without her to dare to go in search of the hot tea which she saw the passengers drinking thankfully. It was a raw, grey day, and Alex, in her thin serge coat and skirt that had been so much too hot in Italy, shivered violently. Her gloves were nearly threadbare, and her hands felt clammy and stiff. She took off her little black straw toque, and leant her head against the back of the seat, wishing that she could sleep. It seemed to her that the other people in the carriage were looking at her suspiciously, and she closed her eyes so as not to see them. After a long while the train started. Alex tried to make plans. In the shabby purse which she had clasped in her hand all the way, for fear of its being stolen, was a piece of paper with Barbara's address. She would not go to Clevedon Square, for fear of Cedric's unknown wife. Cedric, with a wife and child! Alex marvelled, and could not believe that she might soon make the acquaintance of these beings who seemed to her so nearly mythical. The thought of Barbara as a widow living in a little house of her own in Hampstead seemed far less unfamiliar. Barbara had always written regularly to Alex, and had twice been to see her when she was in the English house, and once in her early days in Belgium. Barbara had often said in her letters that she was very lonely, and that it was terrible having to live so far out of town because of expenses. Ralph, poor dear, had left her very, very badly off, and there had been very little more for her on the death of Sir Francis. Alex supposed that Downshire Hill must be a very unfashionable address, but she did not connect N.W. with any particular locality. She was always very stupid at finding her way about, and anyhow her bag was heavy. She decided that she would take a cab. At Charing Cross it was raining and the noise was deafening. Alex had meant to send Barbara a telegram from Folkestone, but had not known where to find the telegraph office, and she now realised with a pang of dismay that her sister would not be expecting her. "How stupid I am, and how badly I manage things," she thought. "I hope she won't be out." The number of taxis at the station bewildered Alex, who had only seen one or two crawling about the streets in Rome, and had heard of them, besides, as ruinously expensive. She found a four-wheeled cab and put her bag on the floor. The man did not get down from his box to open the door for her, as she expected. He leant down and asked hoarsely, "Where do you want to go, miss?" "Downshire Hill," said Alex. "Number 101. "Downshire Hill? Where's that?" "I don't know," said Alex, frightened. She wondered if the man was drunk, and prepared to pull her bag out of the cab again. "Half a minute." He called out something unintelligible to another driver and received an answer. "Downshire Hill's N.W.," he then informed her. "Out Hampstead way." "Yes," said Alex. "Can't you take me there?" He looked at her shabby clothes and white, frightened face. "I'd like to see my fare first, if you please," he said insolently. Alex was too much afraid of his making a scene to refuse. "How much will it be?" "7 and 6pence, miss." She pulled 2 half-crowns out of her purse. It was all she had left. "This is all the change I have," she told him in a shaking voice. "They will pay the rest when I get there." He muttered something dissatisfied, but put the coins into his pocket. Alex climbed into the cab. It jolted away very slowly. The rain was falling fast and dashing against the windows of the cab. Alex glanced out, but the streets through which they were driving were all unfamiliar to her. It seemed a very long way to Downshire Hill. She began to wonder very much how Barbara would receive her, and how she could make clear to her the long, restless agony that had led her to obtain release from her vows. Would Barbara understand? Letters had been very inadequate, and although Barbara had written that Alex had better come to her for a while if she meant to return to England, she had given no hint of any deeper comprehension. "We must make plans when we meet," she had written at the end of the letter. Alex wondered with a sense of apprehension what those plans would be. She had for so long become accustomed to being treated as a chattel, without volition of her own, that it did not occur to her that she would have any hand in forming her future life. Presently she became conscious that the rain had stopped, and that the atmosphere was lighter. She let down the glass of the window nearest her, and saw with surprise that there was a rolling expanse of green, with a number of willow trees on one side of the road. It did not look like London. Then the cab turned a corner, and Alex saw Downshire Hill on a small board against the wall. This was where Barbara lived, then. The little houses were small and compact, but of agreeably varying height and shape, with a tiny enclosure of green in front of each, protected by railings and a little gate. Number 101, before which the cab drew up, had a bush that Alex thought must be lilac, and was covered with ivy. There were red blinds to the windows. She got out, pulling her heavy bag after her, and timidly pushed open the little gate, glancing up at the windows as she did so. There was no one to be seen. Still clutching at her suitcase, Alex pulled the bell faintly. "There's half my fare owing yet," said the cabman gruffly. Thus reminded, Alex rang again. An elderly parlour-maid with iron-grey hair and a hard face opened the door. Is Mrs. McAllister at home?" faltered Alex. "I'll inquire," said the maid, with a lightning glance at the suitcase. She left the door open, and Alex saw a little flight of stairs. A murmured colloquy took place at the top, and then Barbara, slight and severely black-clad, came down. "Alex, that's not you?" "Yes. Oh, Barbara!" "My dear, I've been expecting to hear from you every day. I've been imagining all sorts of awful things. Why didn't you wire? Do come in. You must be dead. And have you been carrying that huge bag?" "I came from the station in a cab." "A cab?" echoed Barbara in rather a dismayed voice. "What a long way to come, when you could have done it so easily by the Underground Railway. But I suppose you didn't know?" "No," repeated Alex blankly. "I didn't know." "What's he waiting for? Will he carry your trunk upstairs?" "That's all the luggage I have, and I can carry it up quite well, and it isn't heavy. But I hadn't quite enough money for the fare. He ought to have another half-crown." "Oh dear," said Barbara. "Wait a minute then, Alex." She disappeared up the stairs, leaving Alex alone with the severe parlour-maid, who still held open the front door. She leant against the wall in the tiny passage, wondering what she had expected of her actual arrival, that the reality should give her such a sense of misery. If only she had telegraphed to Barbara from Folkestone. "Here's 2 shillings. Ada, have you got a sixpence by any chance?" "There's sixpence in the kitchen," said Ada, and fetched it. "There," said Barbara. "Pay him then, please, Ada. Now, Alex, come upstairs and sit down. You look dreadfully ill and worn out, my dear." Alex lifted the suit-case again. "Oh, Ada will see to that. Your room is all ready, Alex. It's very small, but then the house is a perfect doll's house, as you see. This is my tiny drawing-room." "It's very pretty," said Alex, sinking into a chair. "It's not bad. The things are nice enough. Ralph had some exquisite things, but of course the house is too hateful, and I hate living all the way out here. No one ever comes near me. Cedric's wife can't get her chauffeur to bring her. He pretends he doesn't know where it is. The only person who ever comes is Pamela." "I thought she was to live with you." "Pam? Oh, she wouldn't bury herself out here for long. Pam's very much in request, my dear. She's been paying visits all over the place and can go on indefinitely, I believe. She makes her headquarters with Cedric and Violet in Clevedon Square, you know, but of course she'll marry. Pam's all right. Last time I saw Pam she was in short frocks and a pigtail. She's come out in the most extraordinary way, every one says so. Not exactly pretty, but frightfully taking and most awfully attractive to men. They say she's so full of life. I must say when we came out, Alex, we didn't have nearly such a good time as she has. Men seem to go down like ninepins before her. She's always bringing them out here to tea and to look at the view of London from the Heath. One always used to look on Hampstead Heath as a sort of joke. Phil May's drawings and that kind of thing. I certainly never expected to live here, but lots of artists do, and Ralph had a big studio here, and it's very inexpensive. Besides, if you know your way about, it's quite easy to come in and out from town. Pamela always brings her young men on the top of a bus. Girls can do anything nowadays, of course. Fancy father if one of us had done such a thing." "Who looks after her?" asked Alex, rather awestruck. "She looks after herself, my dear, and does it uncommonly effectively. She could marry to-morrow if she liked, and marry well too. Of course Cedric is her guardian in a sort of way, I suppose, but he lets her do anything she like, only laughs." "Cedric," spoke Alex wistfully. "Do you know I haven't seen Cedric since I left Clevedon Square?" "My dear, that's 10 years, isn't it? Cedric's grown up exactly like father. He's got just his way of standing in front of the fire and shaking his spectacles up and down in his hand. You remember father's way? Of course he's done extraordinarily well, every one says so, and his marriage was an excellent thing too." "Is Violet nice?" Barbara laughed rather dryly. "She's got a lot of money, and yes, I suppose she is nice. Between ourselves, Alex, she's the sort of person who rather aggravates me. She's always so prosperous and happy, as though nothing had ever gone wrong with her, or ever could. She's very generous, I will say that for her, and extraordinarily good-natured. Most people adore her. She's the sort of woman that other women rave about, but I must say most men like her too. Her people were rather inclined to think she could have done better for herself than Cedric. Of course, he isn't well off, and she's 2 years older than he is, but it's answered all right, and they were tremendously in love with one another." "Is she very pretty?" "She's inclined to be fat, but of course she is pretty in her own style, very. And the little girl is a perfect darling, little Rosemary. But, Alex, here I am talking you to death when you must be dying for tea. What sort of a crossing did you have?" "Not very bad, but I was ill all the way." "Oh, no wonder you look so washed out," said Barbara, as though relieved. But she went on eyeing her sister uneasily through the rapidly increasing dusk. When Ada came in with the tea appointments, Barbara told her to bring the lamp. "Yes'm. And your bag'm? May I have the key?" Alex looked bewildered, then recollected that the maid was offering to unpack for her, and pulled out the key from her purse. "Isn't there your trunk still to come?" asked Barbara. "No. You see, I hadn't much to bring, only just 1 or 2 things that I got in Rome." Alex wondered if Barbara understood that until a few months ago she had been a nun, living the life of a nun. She thought of the apprehension with which she had viewed making an explanation to Barbara, and almost smiled. It appeared that no explanation would be required of her. But presently Barbara said uneasily, "It seems extraordinary your having no luggage like this, Alex. I don't know what Ada will think, I'm sure. I told her that you'd been living abroad for a good many years. I thought that was the best thing to say. But I never thought of your having no luggage." "I haven't got anything to bring, you see. I must get some things," repeated Alex forlornly. "You see," said her sister half apologetically, "Ada's been with me ever since I married. She was Ralph's mother's maid, and perfectly devoted to him. I couldn't ever get that sort of servant to live out here, if it wasn't for that. She waits at meals and maids me and does everything except the actual cooking. I know she's rather disagreeable in her manner, but she's a perfect treasure to me." When Ada had brought in the lamps and filled the little room with cheerful light, drawing the blinds and curtains, Barbara looked again hard at her sister. "Good heavens, Alex, how thin you are! And you look as though you hadn't slept for a month." "Oh, but I have," said Alex eagerly, and then stopped. She did not feel able to explain to Barbara the insatiable powers of sleep which seemed as though they could never be satisfied, after those 10 years of unvarying obedience to a merciless 5 o'clock bell. "I'm glad to hear it," Barbara replied in a dissatisfied voice, "but I never saw any one so changed. Have you been ill?" "Rather run down," Alex said hurriedly, with the convent instinct of denying physical ills. "I had 2 or 3 very troublesome abscesses in my throat just before Easter, and that left me rather weak." "My dear, how awful! You never told me. Did you have an operation? Are you scarred?" "No, they broke of themselves inside my throat, luckily." "Oh, don't!" cried Barbara, and shuddered. The sisters were very silent during tea. Alex saw her sister looking hard at her hands, and became conscious of contrast. Barbara was thin, but her hands were slender and exceedingly white. She wore besides her wedding ring, a sapphire one which Alex thought must have been her engagement ring. On her wrist was a tiny gold watch and a gold curb chain bracelet. Her own hands, Alex now saw, were more than thin. They were almost emaciated, with knuckles that shone white and a sharp prominence at each wrist bone. They were not white, but rough and mottled, with broken skin round each fingernail. She wondered if her whole person was in as striking a contrast to her sister's. When she had put on the serge skirt and white muslin shirt, the sensation had overwhelmed her, accustomed to the heavy religious habit of being lightly, almost indecently clad. But Barbara's dress was of soft, silky material, with a low, turned-down collar, such as was just beginning to come into fashion. Her hair was piled into a shining knot of little sausage-shaped curls and parted in front. Though she was only 28, the grey in Barbara's hair was plentiful, but her small face looked youthful enough, and had none of the hard lines and shadows that Alex knew to lie round her own eyes and lips. Her little, slight figure was very erect, and she wore black suede shoes with sparkling buckles. Alex looked down at her own clumsy, ill-made boots, which had already begun to hurt her feet, and instinctively put up her hands to the cheap black toque that felt heavy on her head. "Why don't you take off your hat?" Barbara asked her kindly. "I'm sure it would rest you." She was too much used to obedience not to comply instantly, pushing back with both hands the weight of untidy hair that instantly fell over her eyes. "Oh, Alex, your hair!" "It's growing very fast. I've not been cutting it lately. There's just enough to put it up, Barbara." "It's much darker than it used to be, isn't it?" "Yes, it's nearly black now. Do you remember how light the ends used to be? But I think it lost its colour from being always under the veil, you know. The worst of it is that it's not growing evenly. It's all short lengths." "Yes, that's very awkward," said Barbara dispassionately, "especially when it's so straight." Alex reflected that her sister was just as self-contained as ever. "Wouldn't you like to come to your room and rest till dinner, Alex?" Alex got up at once. "You ought to take Plasmon or something of that sort, and try to get a little fatter. There's simply nothing of you, Alex. You're all eyes, with rings like saucers round them." After Barbara had left her in the tiny, pretty bedroom that Alex thought looked wonderfully luxurious, she went straight to her looking-glass. "Good heavens, how ugly I am," she said to herself involuntarily. Her face was sallow, with sunken cheeks, and the Roman sun had powdered her skin all over with little pale freckles. Her eyes, as Barbara had said, had rings like saucers round them, and looked oddly large and prominent from the slight puffiness of the underlids. Her teeth had perhaps suffered most of all. She had had 1 or 2 taken out, and the gaps were visible and unsightly. They had never been very good teeth, and she remembered still all that she had suffered at the hands of an unskilled Brussels dentist in Belgium. For the last few years she had endured intermittent toothache sooner than submit to further torture. and she saw now that a small black patch was spreading between the two front teeth. Barbara, with the grey mingled freely in her light hair, and her severe widow's weeds, might look more than 28, but Alex at 31 bore the semblance of a woman of 40. She hid her face in her disfigured hands. Presently she saw that there was hot water in a little brass can on the washing stand, and she thankfully made use of it. Ada had unpacked everything, and Alex saw the brush and comb that she had hastily purchased on the dressing table. Beside them was the packet of hairpins that she had remembered to get at the last moment, and that was all. "There ought to be something else, but I've forgotten," thought Alex. She wondered if Barbara would expect her to dress for dinner. The idea had not occurred to her. She had one other blouse, a much better one, made of black net, so transparent as to show glimpses of her coarse white cotton underwear, with its high yoke and long sleeves. Her hair, of course, was impossible. Even if it had not been so short and of such an intractable limp straightness, Alex had forgotten how to do it. She remembered with dim surprise that at Clevedon Square Lady Isabel's maid had always done her hair for her. She brushed it away from her face and made a small coil on the top of her head, after the fashion which she remembered best, and tried to fasten back the untidy lengths that fell over her ears and forehead. The hairpins that she had bought were very long and thick. She wished that they did not show so obviously. "Alex?" said Barbara's cool voice at her door. Alex came out and they went downstairs together, Alex a few steps behind her sister, since the stairs were not broad enough for two to walk abreast. She tried awkwardly not to step on the tail of Barbara's black lace tea-gown. Ada waited upon them, and although the helpings of food seemed infinitesimal to Alex, everything tasted delicious, and she wondered if Barbara always had 3 courses, as well as a dessert of fruit and coffee, even when she was by herself. "You don't smoke, I suppose?" Barbara said. "No, of course not. How stupid of me. Let's go up to the drawing-room again." "Barbara, do you smoke?" "No. Ralph hated women to smoke, and I don't like to see it myself, though pretty nearly every one does it now. Violet smokes far too much. I wonder Cedric lets her. But as a matter of fact, he lets her do anything she likes." "I can't realize Cedric married." "I know. Look here, Alex, he'll want to see you, and you'll be wanting to talk over plans, won't you?" "Yes," said Alex nervously. I don't want to have a lot of fuss, you know. Of course I know it's upsetting for everybody, my coming out of the convent after every one thought I was settled. But oh, Barbara, I had to leave." "Personally, I can't think why you ever went in," said Barbara impersonally. "Or why you took 10 years to find out you weren't suited to the life. That sounds unkind, and I don't mean to be, you know I don't. Of course you were right to come away, only I'm afraid they've ruined your health. You're so dreadfully thin, and you look much older than you've any right to, Alex. I believe you ought to go into the country somewhere and have a regular rest cure. Every one is doing them now. However, we'll see what Cedric and Violet say." "When shall I see them?" asked Alex nervously. "Well," said her sister, hesitating, "what about tomorrow? It's better to get it over at once, isn't it? I thought I'd ring them up this evening. I know they're dining at home." She glanced at the clock. "Look here, Alex, why don't you go to bed? I always go early myself, and you're simply dead tired. Do. Then tomorrow we might go into town and do some shopping. You'll want some things at once, won't you?" Alex saw that Barbara meant her to assent, and said yes, in a dazed way. She was very glad to go to her room, and the bed seemed extraordinarily comfortable. Barbara had kissed her and said anxiously, "I do hope you'll feel more like yourself tomorrow, my dear. I hardly feel I know you." Then she had rustled away, and Alex had heard her go downstairs, perhaps to telephone to Clevedon Square. Lying in bed in the dark, she thought about her sister. It seemed incredible to Alex that she could ever have bullied and domineered over Barbara. Yet in their common childhood this had happened. She could remember stamping her foot at Barbara and compelling her to follow her sister's lead again and again. And there was the time when she had forced a terrified, reluctant Barbara to play at tight-rope dancing on the stairs, and Barbara had obediently clambered onto the newel post and fallen backwards into the hall and hurt her back. Alex remembered still the agonized days and nights of despairing remorse which had followed, and her own sense of being all but a murderess. She had thought then she could never, never quarrel and be angry with Barbara again. But she had gone away to school, and Barbara had got well, and in the holidays Alex had been more overbearing than ever in the schoolroom. And now Barbara seemed so infinitely competent, so remote from the failures and emotional disasters that had wrecked Alex. She made Alex feel like a child in the hands of a serious, rather ironical grown-up person who did not quite know how to dispose of it. Alex herself wondered what would happen to her, much as a child might have wondered, but she was tired enough to sleep. And the next morning Barbara, more competent than ever, came in and suggested that she should have her breakfast in bed, so as to feel rested enough for a morning's shopping in town. "Though I must say," said Barbara in a dissatisfied voice, "that you don't look any better than you did last night. I hoped you might look more like yourself after a night's rest. I really don't think the others will know you. Am I going to see them? Oh, I talked to Violet last night on the telephone, and she said I was to give you her love, and she hoped we'd both lunch there tomorrow." "At Clevedon Square?" asked Alex, beginning to tremble. "Yes. You don't mind, do you?" "No, I don't mind." It was very strange to be in the remembered London streets again. Stranger still to be taken to shops by Barbara, and authoritatively guided in the choice of a coat and skirt, and a hat that should conceal as much as possible of the disastrous coiffure underneath, and a pair of black suède walking shoes that felt oddly light and soft to her feet. "There's no hurry about the other things, is there?" said Barbara, more as though stating a fact than a question. "Now we'd better take a taxi to Clevedon Square, or we shall be late." A few moments later, as the taxi turned into the square, she said with what Alex recognized in surprise as a kind of nervousness in her voice: "We thought you'd rather get it all over at once, you know, Alex. Seeing the family, I mean. Pam is staying there anyway, and Violet said Archie was coming to lunch. There'll be nobody else, except perhaps one of Violet's brothers. She's always got one or other of them there." Alex felt sick with dismay. Then some remnant of courage came back to her, and she clenched her hands unseen, and vowed that she would go through with it. The cab stopped before the familiar steps, and Barbara said, as to a stranger, "Here we are." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. All of them. The well-remembered hall and broad staircase swam before Alex's eyes as she followed Barbara upstairs and heard them announced as "Mrs. McAllister and Miss Clare." In a dream she entered the room, and was conscious of a dreamlike feeling of relief at its totally unfamiliar aspect. All the furniture was different, and there was chintz instead of brocade everywhere. She would not have known it. Then she saw with growing bewilderment that the room was full of people. "Alex?" said a soft, unknown voice. Barbara hovered uneasily beside her, and Alex dimly heard her speaking half reassuringly and half apologetically. But Violet Clare had taken her hand and was guiding her into the inner half of the room, which was empty. "Don't bother about the others for a minute. Barbara, go and look after them like a dear. Let's make acquaintance in peace, Alex. Do you know who I am?" "Cedric's wife?" "Yes, that's it." Then, as Barbara left them, Violet noiselessly stamped her foot. "You poor dear. I don't believe she ever told you there was to be a whole crowd of family here. That's just like poor dear Barbara. I'm sure she never had one atom of imagination in her life, now had she? The idea of dragging you here the very day after you got back from such a journey." The soft, fluent voice went on, giving her time to recover herself, Alex hardly hearing what was said to her, but with a sensation of adoring gratitude gradually invading her, for this warm, unhesitating welcome and unquestioning sympathy. She looked dumbly at her sister-in-law. In Violet she saw the soft, generous contours and opulent prettiness of which she had caught glimpses in the South. The numerous marchesas who had come to the convent parlour in Rome had had just such brown, liquid eyes, with dark lashes throwing into relief an opaque ivory skin, just such dazzling teeth and such ready dimpling smiles, and had worn the same wealth of falling laces at décolleté throat and white rounded wrists. Violet was in white, with a single string of wonderful pearls round her soft neck, and her brilliant brown hair was arranged in elaborate waves with occasional little escaping rings and tendrils. Alex thought her beautiful, and wondered why Barbara had spoken in deprecation of such sleepy, prosperous prettiness. She noticed that Violet did not look at her with rather wondering dismay as her sister had done, and only once said, "You do look tired, you poor darling. It's that hateful journey. I'm a fearfully bad traveller myself. When we were married, Cedric wanted to go to the south of France for our honeymoon, but I told him nothing would induce me to risk being seasick, and he had to take me to Cornwall instead. Cedric will be here in a minute, and we'll make him come and talk to you quietly out here. You don't want to go in amongst all that rabble, do you?" "Who's there?" asked Alex faintly. "Pam and the boys. That's my two brothers, you know, whom you needn't bother about the very least bit in the world. And here's Archie," she added as the door opened again. Alex would have known Archie in a moment, anywhere. He was so like their mother. Even the first inflection of his voice as he came towards Violet reminded her of Lady Isabel. She had not seen him since his schooldays, and wondered if he would have recognised her without Violet's ready explanation. "Alex has come, Archie. That goose Barbara went and brought her here without explaining that she's only just got back to England and is naturally tired to death. I'll leave you to talk while I see what's happened to Cedric." "I say!" exclaimed Archie, and stood looking desperately embarrassed. "How are you, Alex, old girl? We meet as strangers, what?" "I should have known you anywhere, Archie. You're so like Barbara, so like mother." "They say Pam's exactly like what mother was. Have you seen her?" "No, not yet. Violet brought me in here." "I say, she's a ripper, isn't she? Cedric didn't do badly for himself. Trust him. Wonder what the beggar'll be up to next. He's done jolly well, all along the line. Retrieved the family fortunes, what? It only remains for me to wed an American, and Pamela to bring off her South African millionaire. She's got one after her, did you know?" He spoke with a certain boyish eagerness that was rather attractive, but his rapid speech and restless manner made Alex wonder if he was nervous. "Couldn't you ask Pamela to come to me here, so that I could see her without all those people?" "What people? It's only old Jack Temple and Carol. Harmless as kittens, what? But I'll get Pam for you in 2 twos, you watch." He put his fingers into his mouth and emitted a peculiar low whistle on 2 prolonged notes. The signal was instantly answered from the other room, but quaveringly, as though the whistler were laughing. Then in a minute she appeared, very slim and tall, in the opening between the 2 rooms. "I like your cheek, Archie. I say, Pam, Alex is here." "Oh, Alex!" Pamela, too, looked and sounded rather embarrassed as she came forward, and laid a fresh, glowing cheek against her sister's. "Barbara telephoned last night that you'd come, and seemed awfully seedy," she said in a quick, confused way. "She ought to have made you rest today." "Oh, no, I'm all right," said Alex awkwardly. "How you've changed, Pamela. I haven't seen you since you were at school." Looking at her sister, she secretly rather wondered at what Barbara had said of the girl's attractiveness. Pamela's round face was glowing with health and colour, and she held herself very upright. But Alex thought that her hair looked ugly, plastered exaggeratedly low on her forehead, and she could not see the resemblance to their mother of which Archie had spoken, except in the fairness of colouring which Pamela shared with Barbara and with Archie himself. "You've changed too, Alex. You look so frightfully thin, and you've lost all your colour. Have you been ill?" "No, I've not been ill, only rather run down. I was ill before Easter. Perhaps that's it." Alex was embarrassed too, a horrible feeling of failure and inadequacy creeping over her and seeming to hamper her in every word and movement. Pamela's cold, rather wondering scrutiny made her feel terribly unsure of herself. She had often known the sensation before, at school, in her early days at the novitiate, again in Rome, and ever since her arrival in England. It was the helpless insecurity of one utterly at variance with her surroundings. She was glad when Violet came back and said, "Here's Cedric. Go down to lunch, children. We'll follow you." Cedric's greeting to his sister was the most affectionate and the least awkward that she had yet received. He kissed her warmly and said, "Well, my dear, I'm glad we've got you back in England again. You must come to us if Barbara will spare you." "Oh, Cedric!" She looked at him for a moment, emotionally shaken. That Cedric should have grown into a man! She saw in a moment that he was very good looking, the best looking of them all, with Sir Francis's pleasantly serious expression and the merest shade of pomposity in his manner. Only the blinking, short-sighted grey eyes behind his spectacles remained of the solemn little brother she had known. "Come down and have some lunch, dear. What possessed Barbara to bring you here if you didn't feel up to coming? We could have gone to Hampstead. Violet says she's been most inconsiderate to you." "Yes, most," said Violet herself placidly. "Dear Barbara is always so unimaginative. Of course, it's fearfully trying for Alex, after being away such ages, to have every one thrust upon her like this." Alex felt a throb of gratitude. "Barbara thought it had better all be got over at once," she said timidly. "That's just like her. Barbara has been completely ruined by that parlour maid of hers, Ada. I always think Ada's responsible for all Barbara's worst inspirations. She rules her with a rod of iron. Shall you hate coming down to lunch, Alex? Those riotous children will be off directly. They're wild about the skating rink at Olympia. Then we can talk comfortably." She put her hand caressingly through Alex's arm as they went downstairs. Alex felt that she could have worshipped her sister-in-law for her easy, pitying tenderness. The consciousness of it helped her all through the long meal, when the noise of laughter and conversation bewildered her after so many years of convent refectories and silence, and her solitary dinners in Rome. Violet had placed her between Cedric and Pamela, and the girl chatted to her intermittently without appearing to require any answer. "Are you boys ready?" she cried just as coffee was brought in. "We can't wait for coffee. Come on, my instructor will be engaged." "How are you going, Pam?" asked Violet. "Underground. It's the quickest." "Oh no, Pam, take a taxi. Archie, you must." Between laughter and admonition they were dispatched, Pamela, Archie, and the two Temple boys, all laughing and talking, and exchanging allusions and references unintelligible to Alex. The room seemed much quieter and darker when the hall door had finally slammed behind them. Alex looked round her. At the head of his own table Cedric sat reflective. Violet lounged, smoking a cigarette and laughing, where Lady Isabel's place had always been. Opposite Alex, Barbara, in her prim black, was leaning forward and speaking. "What's the attraction about this roller skating? Pamela seems to do nothing else when she isn't dancing." "Every one's doing it, my dear. I want to take it up myself so as to reduce my figure, but it's such an impossible place to get at. I've only been to Olympia for the military tournaments. But Pam has a perfect passion for getting about by the Underground Railway. Alex, isn't Pam a refreshing person?" Alex felt uncertain as to her meaning and was startled at being addressed. She knew that she coloured and looked confused. "My dear," said Barbara impressively, "your nerves must simply have gone to pieces. Imagine jumping like that when you're spoken to. Don't you think she ought to do a rest cure, Violet? There's a place in Belgrave Street." "No, no," said Violet's kind, soft voice. "She's coming to us. You must let us have her, Barbara, for a good long visit. Mustn't she, Cedric?" "Of course. You must have your old quarters upstairs, Alex." The kindness nearly made her cry. She felt as might a child, expecting to be scolded and punished, and unexpectedly met with smiles and reassurance. "Come up and see baby," said Violet. "She's such a little love, and I want her to know her new auntie." "Violet, we really must talk business some time," said Barbara, hesitating. "There are plans to be settled, you know, what Alex is going to do next." "She's going to play with Rosemary next. Don't worry, dear, we can talk plans any time. There's really no hurry." Alex dimly surmised that the words, and the indolent, dégagé smile accompanying them, might be characteristic of her new sister-in-law. Violet took her upstairs. "The nursery's just the same. We haven't changed a thing," she told her. Alex gave a cry of recognition at the top of the stairs. "Oh, the little gate that fenced off the landing. It was put up when Cedric was a baby because he would run out and look through the balusters." "Was it really?" cried Violet delightedly. "Cedric didn't know that. He told me that it had always been there. I shall love having you, Alex. You'll be able to tell me such lots of things about Cedric when he was a little boy that no one else knows. You see, there's so little difference between him and Barbara, isn't there?" "I'm only 3 years older than Barbara." "Then you're the same age, or a little older than I am. I'm 29. 2 whole years older than Cedric. Isn't it dreadful?" She laughed gaily as she turned the handle of the nursery door. "Baby precious, where are you?" Alex followed her into the big sunny room. A young nurse in stiff white piqué sat sewing in the window, and a starched, blue-ribboned baby, with disordered sunny curls, crawled about the floor at her feet. When she saw her mother, she began to run towards her, with outstretched hands and inarticulate coos of pleasure. "Come along, then, and see your new auntie." Violet caught her up and lifted her into her arms. "Isn't she rather a love, Alex? Shall we look after her for a little while Nurse goes downstairs?" Alex nodded. She felt as though she hardly dared speak for fear of frightening the pretty little laughing child. Besides, the constriction was tightening in her throat. Violet sank down into a low chair with Rosemary still in her arms. "I'll stay with her, nurse, if you like to go downstairs for half an hour." "Thank you, m'lady." "Sit down and let's be comfy, Alex. Isn't this much nicer than being downstairs?" Alex looked round the nursery. As Violet had said, it had not been altered. On the mantelpiece she suddenly saw the big white clock supported by stout Dresden china cherubs that had been there ever since she could remember. It was ticking in a sedate, unalterable way. Something in the sight of the clock, utterly familiar and yet forgotten altogether during all her years away from Clevedon Square, suddenly caught at Alex. She made an involuntary choking sound, and to her own dismay sobs suddenly overpowered her. "My poor dear," said Violet compassionately, "do cry, it'll do you good, and baby and I won't mind, or ever tell a soul. Will we, my Rosemary? I knew you'd feel much better when you'd had it out, and nobody will disturb us here." Alex had sunk onto the floor and was leaning her head against Violet's chair. The soft, murmuring voice went on above her. "I never heard of such a thing in my life as Barbara's bringing you here today. She never explained when she telephoned that you hadn't been in England for goodness knows how many years, let alone to this house. And of course I thought she'd settled it all with you, till I saw your face when she brought you into the drawing-room, all full of tiresome people and brothers and sisters you haven't set eyes on for years. Then I knew, of course, and I could have smacked her. You poor child." "No, no," sobbed Alex incoherently. "It's only just at first, and coming back and finding them all so changed, and not knowing what I'm going to do." "Do? Why, you're coming here. Cedric and Rosemary and I want you, and Barbara doesn't deserve to keep you after the way she's begun. I'll settle it all with her." "Oh, how kind you are to me!" cried Alex. Violet bent down and kissed her. "Kind? Why, aren't I your sister, and Rosemary your one and only niece? Look at her, Alex, and see if she's like any one. Cedric sometimes says she's like your father." "A little, perhaps, but she's very like you, I think." "Oh, I never had those great round grey eyes. Those are Cedric's. And perhaps yours. They're the same colour. Anyway, I believe she's really very like what you must have been as a baby, Alex." It was evident that Violet was paying the highest compliment within her power. Alex put out her hand timidly to little Rosemary. She was not at all shy, and seemed accustomed to being played with and admired as she sat on her mother's lap. Alex thought how pretty and happy she and Violet looked together. She was emotionally too much worn out, and had for too many years felt herself to be completely and for ever outside the pale of warm human happiness to feel any pang of envy. Presently Violet reluctantly gave up Rosemary to the nurse again, and said, "I'm afraid we ought to go down. I don't like to leave Barbara any longer. She never comes up here, hardly ever. Poor Barbara, I sometimes think it's because she hasn't any babies of her own. Let's come down and find her, Alex." They found Barbara in the library earnestly talking to Cedric, who was leaning back, smoking and looking very much bored. He sprang up when they entered, and from his relieved manner and from Barbara's abrupt silence, Alex conjectured that they had been discussing her own return. She stood for a moment, forlorn and awkward, till Violet sank onto the big red leather sofa and held out her hand in invitation to her. "Give me a cigarette, Cedric. What have you and Barbara been plotting, like two conspirators?" Cedric laughed, looking at her with a sort of indulgent pride, but Barbara said with determined rapidity, "It's all very well, Violet, to laugh, but we've got to talk business. After all, this unexpected step of Alex's has made a lot of difference. One thought of her as absolutely settled, as father did when he made his will." "You see, Alex," Cedric told his sister, "the share which should have been yours was divided by father's will between Barbara and Pamela, and there was no mention of you, except just for the £50 a year which my father thought would pay your actual living expenses in the convent. He never thought of your coming away again." "How could he, after all these years?" ejaculated Barbara. "I know, but I couldn't have stayed on, Cedric. Indeed I couldn't. I know I ought to have found out sooner that I wasn't fitted for the life, but if you knew what it's all been like—" Her voice broke huskily, and despair overwhelmed her at the thought of trying to explain what they would never understand. "Poor little thing," said Violet's compassionate voice. "Of course you couldn't stay on. They've nearly killed you as it is, wretched people." "No, no, they were kind." "The point is, Alex," Barbara broke in, "that you've only got the wretched £50 a year. Of course, I'd be more than glad to let you have what would naturally have been yours, but how on earth I'm to manage it, I don't know. Cedric can tell you what a state poor Ralph left his affairs in. You'd never believe how little I have to live on. Of course, the money from father was a godsend, I don't deny it. But if Cedric thinks it's justice to give it back to you—" She looked terribly anxious, gazing at her brother. "No, no, Barbara," said Alex, horrified. "I don't want the money. Of course you must keep it, you and Pamela." "That's all very well, my dear Alex," said Cedric sensibly. "But how do you propose to live? You must look at it from a practical point of view." "Then you think—" broke from Barbara irrepressibly. "No, my dear, I don't. One knows very well, as things are, as poor Ralph left things, it would be almost out of the question to expect—" He looked helplessly at his wife. "Of course, dear," she said placidly, "but there's Pamela's share." "Pamela will marry, of course. She's sure to marry. But until then, or at least until she comes of age, I don't think, as her guardian—" Cedric broke off, looking much harassed. "If Pam married a rich man, which she probably will," said Violet, with a low laugh. "We can't take distant possibilities into consideration," Barbara interposed sharply. "We're dealing with actual facts." Alex looked from one to the other with bewilderment. She hardly understood what they were all discussing. From the natural home of her childhood and girlhood, where she had lived as unthinking of ways and means as every other girl of her class and generation, she had passed into the convent world, where all was communal and the rights of the individual a thing part shunned, part unknown. She could not, at first, grasp that Cedric and Barbara and Violet, perhaps Pam and Archie too, were all wondering how she would be able to maintain herself on £50 a year. "Of course," Barbara was saying, "Alex could come to me for a bit. I'd love to have you, dear. But you saw for yourself what a tiny place mine is, and there's only Ada. I don't quite know what she'd say to having 2 people instead of 1, I must say." "We want her too," Violet exclaimed caressingly. "Let us have her for a little while, Barbara, while you're preparing Ada's mind for the shock." She broke into her low, gurgling laugh again. Barbara looked infinitely relieved. "What do you think, Alex? It isn't that I wouldn't love to have you, but there's no denying that ways and means do count, and in a tiny household like mine, every item adds up." "Oh," said Alex desperately, "I know what you must feel, the difficulty of knowing what to do with me. It's always been like that, ever since I was a little girl. I've made a failure of everything. Don't you remember, Barbara, you must, old Nurse saying, 'Alex will never stick to anything'? And I never have. I never shall. I can only make dreadful muddles and failures and upset you all. If only one could wreck one's own life without interfering with other people's." There was a silence which Alex, after her outburst, knew very well was not one of comprehension. Then Cedric said gently: "You mustn't let yourself exaggerate, my dear. We're very glad to have you with us again. One only can't help wishing it had been rather sooner. But there's no use in crying over spilt milk, and after all, as Violet says, there's no hurry about anything. Come to us and have a good long rest. You look as though you needed it, and get a little flesh on your bones again. We can settle all the rest afterwards." Alex saw Barbara looking at her with furtive eagerness. She turned to her with the utter dependence on another's judgment that had become second nature to her. "When shall I go?" "My dear," protested Barbara, "of course the longer you can stay with me the better I shall be pleased. It's only that Ada—" She broke off at the sound of Violet's irrepressible laugh. "You must suit yourself absolutely, of course." "Supposing you came to us at the end of the week," Violet suggested. "Say Saturday? Pamela is going away then to pay 1 or 2 visits, and I shall have you all to myself." Alex looked at her wonderingly. It seemed to her incredible that Violet should actually want her, so ingrained was her sense of her own isolation of spirit, that terrible isolation of those who have definitely, and for long past, lost all self-confidence, and which can never be realized or penetrated by those outside. "That will be delightful," said Violet, seeming to take her acceptance for granted. Barbara got up, smoothing her skirt gently. "We really ought to be going, Alex. I said we'd be in to tea, and it takes such ages to get back." Alex rose submissively. She marvelled at the assurance of Barbara, even at the ease of her conventionally affectionate farewells. "Well, good-bye, my dear. When are you coming out to the wilds to look me up?" Then, without giving her sister-in-law time to reply, she added gaily, "You must ring me up and let me know when you have a spare moment. You know I'm always a fixture. What a blessing the telephone is." "Then we'll see you on Saturday, Alex?" said her brother. "Good. Take care of yourself, my dear." He looked after her with an expression of concern as the servant held open the door for her and Barbara, and they went into the street. Alex could not believe that this kindly, rather pompous man was her younger brother. "Cedric has grown very good-looking, but I didn't expect to see him so old, somehow," she said. Barbara laughed. "Time hasn't stood still with any of us, you know. I think Violet looks older than he does. She is, of course. She'll be a mountain in a few years' time if she doesn't take care." "Oh, Barbara, I think she's so pretty and sweet." Barbara shrugged her shoulders very slightly. "She and I have never made particularly violent friends, though I like her, of course. Pamela adores her, and I must say she's been good to Pam. But her kindness doesn't cost her anything. She's always been rich and had everything she wanted. She was the only girl, and her people adored her, and now Cedric lets her do everything she likes. She spends any amount of money. Look at her clothes and the way she has little Rosemary always dressed in white." "Rosemary's lovely. It's so extraordinary to think of Cedric's child." Barbara tightened her lips. She ought to have been a boy, of course. Cedric pretended not to care, but it must have been a disappointment, and goodness only knows if Violet will ever. She stopped, throwing a quick glance out of the corners of her eyes at her sister. Alex wondered why she did not finish her sentence, and what she had been about to say. The constraint in her intercourse with Barbara was becoming more and more evident to her perceptions. It was clear that her sister did not intend to ask any questions as to the crisis through which Alex had passed, and when she had once ascertained that Alex had not seen anybody whilst in Rome, she did not refer to that either. Alex wondered if Barbara would tell her anything of Ralph and their married life, but the reserve which had always been characteristic of Barbara since her nursery days had hardened sensibly, and it was obvious that she wished neither to give nor to receive confidences. She was quite ready, however, to discuss her brother Cedric and his wife, or the prospects of Pamela and Archie, and Alex listened all the evening to Barbara's incisive little clear tones, delivering shrewd comments and judgments. She again suggested that Alex should go to bed early, saying as she kissed her good night, "It's quite delightful to have someone to talk to, for me. I generally read or sew all the evening." "It must be lonely for you, Barbara." "Oh, I don't mind quiet," she laughed, as though edging away from any hint of emotional topic. "But of course it's nice to have someone for a change. Good night." She turned towards the door of the bedroom. "Oh, Alex, there's just one thing. I know you'd rather I said it. If you wouldn't mind, sometime, any time you think of it, just letting me have the money for those clothes we bought for you today. The bills have come in. I asked for them as I don't have an account. I knew you'd rather be reminded, knowing what pauper I am. I only wish I hadn't got to worry you. Good night, my dear. Sleep well." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Violet. For days and nights to come, the question of the money that Barbara had paid for her clothes weighed upon Alex. She had no idea how she was to repay her. The money that had been given her in Rome for her journey to England had only lasted her to Charing Cross, and even her cab fare to Hampstead had been supplemented by Barbara. Alex remembered it with fresh dismay. Even when she had left Downshire Hill and was in Clevedon Square again, the thought lashed her with a secret terror, until one day she said to Cedric, "What ought I to do, Cedric, to get my £50 a year? Who do I get it from?" "Don't Pumphrey and Scott send it half yearly? I thought that was the arrangement. You gave them your change of address, I suppose?" "Oh, no," said Alex gently. "I've never written to them, except once, just after father died, to ask them to make the cheques payable to the Superior." "What on earth made you do that?" "They thought it was best. You see, I had no banking account, so the money was paid into the Community's account." "I see," Cedric remarked drily. "Well, the sooner you write and revoke that arrangement, the better. When did they last send you a cheque? In June?" "I don't know," Alex was forced to say, feeling all the time that Cedric must be thinking her a helpless, unpractical fool. Write and find out. And meanwhile, I say, Alex, have you enough to go on with?" I haven't any money, Cedric. In Rome they gave me enough for my travelling expenses, but nothing is left of that." "But what have you done all this time? I suppose you've wanted clothes and things?" "I got some with Barbara, but they aren't paid for. And there are some other things I need, you see. I haven't got anything at all. Not even stamps," said Alex forlornly. "Violet said something about taking me to some shops with her, but I suppose all her places are very expensive." "They are dashed expensive," Cedric admitted with a short laugh. "But look here, Alex, will you let me advance you what you want? It couldn't be helped, of course, but the whole arrangement comes rather hard on you as things are now. You see, poor Barbara is really as badly off as she can be. Ralph was a most awful ass, between ourselves, and muddled away the little he had, and she gets pretty nearly nothing except a widow's pension, which was very small, and the money father left. If you'll believe me, Ralph didn't even insure his life before going to South Africa. Of course, he didn't go to fight, but on the staff of one of the big papers, and it was supposed to be a very good thing. And then what did he do but go and get dysentery before he'd been there a fortnight?" Cedric's voice held all the pitying scorn of the successful. "Poor Barbara," said Alex. "That's just what she is. Of course, I think myself that Pamela will make your share over to you again when she marries. She's not likely to make a rotten bad match like Barbara, far from it. But until then she can't do anything, you know, at least not until she's of age, if then." Cedric stopped, and his right hand tapped with his spectacles on his left hand in the little characteristic trick that was so like Sir Francis. Alex had already heard him make much the same observations, but she realised that Cedric had retained all his old knack of reiteration. "I see," she said. "Well, my dear, the long and the short of it is that you must let me be your banker for the time being. And Alex," said Cedric, with a most unwonted touch of embarrassment breaking into his kind, assured manner, "you needn't mind taking it. There's plenty of money here. There is really nowadays." Alex realised afterwards that it would hardly have occurred to her to mind taking the £20 which Cedric offered her with such patent diffidence. She had never known the want of money, either in her Clevedon Square days or during her 10 years of convent life. She did not realise its value in the eyes of other people. The isolation of her point of view on this and other kindred subjects gradually became evident to her. Her scale of relative values had remained that which had been set before her in the early days of her novitiate. That held by her present surroundings differed from it in almost every particular, and more especially in degree of concentration. All Violet's warm, healthy affection for Rosemary did not prevent her intense preoccupation with her own clothes and her own jewels, or her innocently assured conviction that no one was ever in London during the month of August, and that to be so would constitute a calamity. All Cedric's pride in his wife and love for her in no way lessened his manifest satisfaction at his own success in life and at the renovated fortunes of the house of Clare. Both he and Violet found their recreation in playing bridge, Cedric at his club and Violet in her own house, or at the houses of what seemed to Alex an infinite succession of elaborately gowned friends, with all of whom she seemed to be on exactly the same terms of an unintimate affection. Violet at night, when she dismissed her maid and begged Alex to stay and talk to her until Cedric came upstairs, which he never did until past 12 o'clock, was adorable. She listened to Alex's incoherent, nervous outpourings, which Alex herself knew to be vain and futile from the very longing which possessed her to make herself clear, and said no word of condemnation or of questioning. At first the gentle pressure of Violet's soft hand on her hair, and her low, sympathetic, murmuring voice, soothed Alex to a sort of worn-out, tearful gratitude, in which she would nightly cry herself to sleep. It was only as she grew slowly physically stronger that the craving for self-expression, which had tormented her all her life, woke again. Did Violet understand? She would reiterate her explanations and dissections of her own past misery with a growing consciousness of morbidity and a positive terror lest Violet should at last repulse, however gently, the endless demand for an understanding that Alex herself perpetually declared to be impossible. It now seemed to her that nothing mattered so long as Violet understood, and by that understanding restored to Alex in some degree her utterly shattered self-respect and self-confidence. This dependence grew the more intense as she became more aware how unstable was her foothold in the world of normal life. With the consciousness of an enormous and grotesque mistake behind her, mingled all the convent tradition of sin and disgrace attached to broken vows and the return to an abjured world. One night she said to Violet, "I didn't do anything wrong in entering the convent. It was a mistake, and I'm bearing the consequence of the mistake. But it seems to me that people find it much easier to overlook a sin than a mistake." "Well, I'd rather ask a divorcée to lunch than a woman who ate peas off her knife," Violet admitted candidly. "That's what I mean. There's really no place for people who've made bad mistakes, anywhere. If you mean yourself, Alex dear, you know there's always a place for you here, just as long as you're happy with us. Only I'm sometimes afraid that it's not quite the sort of life, after all you've been through, you poor dear. I know people do come in and out a good deal, and it will be worse than ever when Pam is at home. Violet, you're very good to me. You're the only person who has seemed at all to understand." "My dear, I do understand. Really, I think I do. It's just as you say, you made a mistake when you were very young. Much too young to be allowed to take such a step, in my opinion, and you're suffering the most bitter consequences. But no one in their senses could blame you, either for going into that wretched place or, still less, for coming out of it. One is always blamed by someone, I think, for every mistake. People would rather forgive one for murder than for making a fool of oneself." "Forgiveness," said Violet thoughtfully. "It's rather an overrated virtue, in my opinion. I don't think it ought to be very hard to forgive any one loved anything." "Would you forgive anything, Violet?" "I think so," said Violet, looking rather surprised. "Unless I were deliberately deceived by someone whom I trusted. That's different. Of course, one might perhaps forgive even then, in a way, but it wouldn't be the same thing again, ever." "No," said Alex. "No, of course not. Every one feels the same about deceit." In the depths of her own consciousness, Alex was groping dimly after some other standard, some elusive certainty that continually evaded her. Were not those things which were hardest to forgive the most in need of forgiveness? Alex, with the self-distrust ingrained in the unstable, wondered if that question were not born of the fundamental weakness in her own character, which had led her all her life to evade or pervert the truth in a passionate fear lest it should alienate from her the love and confidence that she craved for from others. Sometimes she thought, "Violet will find me out, and then she will stop being fond of me." And knowing that her claim on Violet's compassion was the strongest link that she could forge between them, she would dilate upon the mental and physical misery of the last 2 years, telling herself all the time that she was trading on her sister's pity. Her days in Clevedon Square were singularly empty, after Violet had tried the experiment of taking Alex about with her to the houses of 1 or 2 old friends, and Alex had come back trembling and nearly crying, and begging never to go again. Her nerves were still utterly undependable, and her health had suffered no less than her appearance. Violet would have taken her to see a doctor, but Alex dreaded the questions that he would of necessity put to her, and Cedric, who distrusted inherently the practice of any science of which he himself knew nothing, declared that rest and good food would be her best physicians. Sometimes she went to see Barbara at Hampstead, but seldom willingly. One of her visits there was the occasion for a stupid, childish lie, of which the remembrance made her miserable. Alex, amongst other unpractical disabilities, was as entirely devoid as it is possible to be of any sense of direction. She had never known how to find her way about, and would turn as blindly and instinctively in the wrong direction as a Dartmoor pony turns tail to the wind. For 10 years she had never been outside the walls of the convent alone, and when she had lived in London as a girl, she could not remember ever having been out of doors by herself. Violet, always driven everywhere in her own motor, and accustomed to Pamela's modern resourcefulness and independence, never took so childish an inability into serious consideration. "Alex, dear, Barbara hoped you'd go down to her this afternoon. Will you do that or come to Ranelagh? The only thing is, if you wouldn't mind going to Hampstead in a taxi. I shall have to use the Mercedes, and the little car is being cleaned." "Of course I shouldn't mind. I'll go to Barbara, I think." "Just whichever you like best. And you'll be back early, won't you? Because we're dining at 7, and you know how ridiculous Cedric is about punctuality and the servants and all that sort of thing." After Violet had gone, in all her soft, elaborate laces and flower-wreathed hat, Alex, with every instinct of her convent training set against the extravagance of a taxi, started out on foot, rejoicing that a sunny July day should give her the opportunity of enjoying Pamela's boasted delight, the top of an omnibus. She took the wrong one, discovered her mistake too late, and spent most of the afternoon in bewilderedly retracing her own footsteps. Finally she found a taxi and arrived at Downshire Hill very tired and after 5 o'clock. Barbara was shocked, as Alex had known she would be, at the taxi. "Violet is so inconsiderate. Because she can afford taxis as a matter of course herself, she never thinks that other people can't. I know myself how every shilling mounts up. I'll see you into an omnibus when you go, Alex. It takes just under an hour, and you need only change once." But that change took place at the junction of 4 roads, all of them seething with traffic. And again Alex was hopelessly at sea, and boarded at last an omnibus that conveyed her swiftly in the wrong direction. She was late for dinner, and when Cedric inquired, with his assumption of the householder whose domestic routine has been flung out of gear, what had delayed her, she stammered and said that Barbara had kept her. She hadn't let her start early enough, had mistaken the time. It was just such a lie as a child might have told in the fear of ridicule or blame, and she told it badly, as a child might have told it, stammering with a frightened widening of her eyes, so that even easy-going Violet looked momentarily puzzled. Alex despised and hated herself. She knew vaguely that her sense of proportion was disorganized. She was a woman of 31, and her faults, her judgments and appreciations, even her mistakes, were those of an ill-regulated, unbalanced child of morbid tendencies. When Pamela came back to Clevedon Square, Alex was first of all afraid of her, and then became jealous of her. She was jealous of Pam's self-confidence, of her enormous security in her own popularity and success, jealous even of the innumerable common interests and the mutual love of enjoyment that bound her and Violet together. She was miserably ashamed of her feelings, and sought to conceal them, none the less as she became aware of a certain shrewdness of judgment underlying all Pamela's breezy vitality and joie de vivre. She and her sister had nothing in common. To Pamela, Alex evidently appeared far removed from herself as a being of another generation, less of a contemporary than pretty, sought-after Violet, or than little Rosemary in her joyous, healthy play. Pamela could accompany Violet everywhere, always radiantly enjoying herself, and receiving endless congratulations, thinly disguised as raillery, on her universal popularity and the charm that she seemed to radiate at will. She could play whole-heartedly with Rosemary, thoroughly enjoying a romp for its own sake, and making even Cedric laugh at her complete abandon. "Don't you like children?" Pamela asked Alex, looking up from the nursery floor where she was playing with her niece. "Yes, I like them," said Alex sombrely. She had been reflecting bitterly that she would have known how to play with a baby of her own. But with Pamela and the nurse in the room, she was afraid of picking up Rosemary and making a fuss with her, as Pam was doing, afraid with the terrible insecurity of the self-conscious. And she never would have babies of her own now. The thought had tormented her often of late, watching Violet with her child, and Pamela with her own radiantly secure future that would hold home and happiness as her rights. But Alex concealed her thoughts, even as far as possible, from herself. The married woman who is denied children may lament her deprivation and receive compassion, but the spinster whose lot forbids her the hope must either conceal her regrets or know herself to be accounted morbid and indelicate. "I like babies while they're small," Pam remarked. "Don't I, you little horror of a niece? Other people's, you know. I don't know that I should want any of my own. They're all very well when they're tiny, but I can't bear them at the tell-me-a-story stage. I make it a rule never to tell the children stories at the houses where I stay. I always say the very first evening that I don't know any. Then they know what to expect. Some girls let themselves be regularly victimized, if they want to please the children's mother and get asked again. I must say I do hate that sort of thing myself, and I don't believe it really does any good. Men are generally frightfully bored by the sort of girl who's perfectly wonderful with children. They'd much rather have one who can play tennis, or who's good at bridge." Pamela laughed comfortably at her own cynicism. "I must say I do think it pays one to be honest in the long run. I always say exactly what I feel myself, and don't care what anyone thinks of me." Alex felt a dull anger at her sister's self-complacent statement of what she knew to be the truth. Pamela could afford to be frank, and her boast seemed to Alex to cast an oblique reflection on herself. She gazed at her without speaking, wretchedly conscious of her own unreason. "Look at Aunt Alex, baby!" mischievously exclaimed Pam in a loud whisper. "We're rather afraid of her when she pulls a long face like that, aren't we? Have we been naughty, do you think?" Alex tried to laugh, contorting her lips stiffly. Pamela jumped up from the floor. "Really and truly, you know, Alex," she gravely told her sister, "you ought to try and make things less au grand sérieux. I think you'd be much happier if you'd only cultivate a sense of humour. We all think so." Then she ran out of the room. Alex sat still. So they all thought that she ought to cultivate a sense of humour. She felt herself to be ridiculous in their eyes, with her eternal air of tragedy, her sombre despair in the midst of their gay, good-humoured conventions that admitted of everything except of weighty, unseasonable gloom. Pamela's spontaneous and unwearied high spirits seemed to throw her own dejection into greater relief, her own utter social incompetence. She began to long for the end of July, when the household in Clevedon Square would be dispersed for the remainder of the summer. Pamela talked incessantly of a yachting invitation which she had received for August, and spoke of the difficulty of sandwiching in country house visits for autumn shooting parties. And Alex knew that Violet's people were taking a house in Scotland, and wanted her and Cedric and the baby to make it their headquarters. She wondered with a sense of impending crisis what would happen to her. At last Cedric said to her, "Have you any particular plans for August, Alex? I want to get Violet up north as soon as possible. She's done so much rushing about lately. I wish you could come with us, my dear, but we're going to the Temples. That's the worst of not having a place of one's own in the country." "Oh," said Alex faintly, "don't bother about me, Cedric. I shall find somewhere." He looked dissatisfied, but said only, "Well, you'll talk it over with Violet. I know she's been vexed at seeing so little of you lately, but Pamela's an exacting young woman, and chaperoning her is no joke. I wish she'd hurry up and get settled. All this rushing about is too much for Violet." "I thought she liked it." "So she does. Anyhow," said Cedric with an odd shy laugh, "she'd like anything that pleased somebody else. She's made like that. I've never known her anything but happy, like sunshine." Then he flung a half-smoked cigarette into the fireplace, looked awkward at his own unusual expression of feeling, and abruptly asked Alex if she'd seen the newspaper. Alex crept away, wondering why happiness should be accounted a virtue. She loved Violet with a jealous, exclusive affection and admiration, but she thought enviously that she too could have been like sunshine if she had received all that Violet received. She too would have liked to be always happy. She had her talk with Violet. There was the slightest shade of wistfulness in Violet's gentleness. "I wish we'd made you happier, but I really believe quiet is what you want most, and things aren't ever very quiet here, especially with Pam. I simply love having her, but I'm not sure she's the best person for you just now. I don't feel I know her very well. I mean, I'm not at all at home with her. She makes me realize what a stranger I am to the younger ones after all these years. Poor Alex. You're much more like my sister than she is, and yet a year ago I didn't know you." "Alex, dear, I'm so glad if I'm a comfort to you, but I wish you wouldn't speak in that bitter way about poor little Pamela. It seems so unnatural." Violet's whole healthy instinct was always, Alex had already discovered, to tend towards the normal, the outlook of well-balanced sanity. She was instinctively distressed by abnormality of any kind. "I didn't really mean it," said Alex hurriedly, with the old fatal instinct of propitiation, and read dissent into the silence that received her announcement. It was the subconscious hope of rectifying herself in Violet's eyes that made her add a moment later, "Couldn't Barbara have me for a little while when you go up to Scotland? I think she would be quite glad." "Of course she would. She's often lonely, isn't she? And you think you'd be happy with her?" "Oh, yes," said Alex eagerly, bent on showing Violet that she had no unnatural aversion from being with her own sister. But Violet still looked rather troubled. "You remember that you found it rather difficult there when you first got back. You said then that Barbara and you had never understood one another, even as children." "Oh, but that will all be different now," said Alex, confused, and knowing that her manner was giving an impression of shiftiness from her very consciousness that she was contradicting herself. As Pamela's claims and her own ceaseless fear of inadequacy made her increasingly unsure of Violet, Alex became less and less at ease with her. The old familiar fear of being disbelieved gave uncertainty to every word she uttered, and she could not afford to laugh at Pam's merciless amusement in pointing out the number of times that she contradicted herself. Violet always hushed Pamela, but she looked puzzled and rather distressed, and her manner towards Alex was more compassionate than ever. Alex, with the impetuous unwisdom of the weak, one day forced an issue. "Violet, do you trust me?" "My dear child, what do you mean? Why shouldn't I trust you? Are you thinking of stealing my pearls?" But Alex could not smile. "Do you believe everything that I say?" Violet looked at her and asked very gently, "What makes you ask, Alex? You're not unhappy about the nonsense that child Pamela sometimes talks, are you?" "No, not exactly. It's just everything." Alex looked miserable, tongue-tied. "Oh, Alex, do try and take things more lightly. You make yourself so unhappy, poor child, with all this self-torment. Can't you take things as they come more?" The counsel found unavailing echo in Alex's own mind. She knew that her mental outlook was wrenched out of all gear, and she knew also in some dim, undefined way that a worn-out physical frame was responsible for much of her self-inflicted torment of mind. Sometimes she wondered whether the impending solution to her whole destiny, still hanging over her, would find her on the far side of the abyss which separates the normal from the insane. The days slipped by, and then, just before the general dispersal, Pamela suddenly announced her engagement to Lord Richard Gunvale, the youngest and by far the wealthiest of her many suitors. "Oh, Pam, Pam!" cried Violet, laughing. "Why couldn't you wait till after we'd left town?" But every one was delighted, and congratulations and letters and presents and telegrams poured in. Pamela declared that she would not be married until the winter, and refused to break her yachting engagement. She was more popular than ever now, and every one laughed at her delightful originality and gazed at the magnificence of the emerald and diamond ring on her left hand. And Alex began to hope faintly that perhaps when Pamela was married things might be different at Clevedon Square. Then one night, just before she was to go to Hampstead, she overheard a conversation between Cedric and his wife. She was on the stairs in the dark, and they were in the lighted hall below, and from the first instant that Cedric spoke, Alex lost all sense of what she was doing and listened. "They're wearing you out, Pam and Alex between them. I won't have any more of it, I tell you." "No, no, my dear old goose, of course they're not." Violet's soft laughter came up to Alex's ears with a muffled sound, as though her head were resting against Cedric's shoulder. "Anyhow, it isn't Pam. I'm delighted about her, of course. Only, Alex, I wish she was happier." "And why isn't she? You're a perfect angel to her," said Cedric resentfully. "I'm so sorry for her, only it's difficult sometimes, a feeling like shifting sands. One doesn't know what to be at with her. If only she said what she wanted or didn't want, right out, but it's that awful anxiety to please, poor darling. She always was like that from our nursery days. You never could get the rights of a matter out of her, plain black or white. She'd say one thing one day and another the next, always. That's what I find so difficult. It's impossible to do anything for a person like that. It's the one thing I can't understand." "Pack her off to Hampstead tomorrow," Cedric observed gruffly. "I will not have you bothered." "Oh, Cedric, I'm not bothered. How can you? She'll be going next week anyway, poor dear, and it may be easier for her to be herself with Barbara, who's her own sister after all. But I don't know what about afterwards when we get back." "You'll have quite enough to think about with Pam's wedding, without Alex on your hands as well, Violet," said Cedric with a note in his voice that Alex had never heard there. "When I think of the way you've behaved to all my wretched family." Alex did not hear Violet's answer, which was very softly spoken. She had turned and gone away upstairs in the dark. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. August. Was it, after all, only for Cedric's sake that Violet had kept her at Clevedon Square, had shown her such heavenly kindness and gentleness? Alex asked herself the question all night long in utter misery of spirit. She had craved all her life for an exclusive, personal affection, and had been mocked with counterfeit again and again. She knew now that it was only in despair at such cheating of fate that she had flung herself rashly to the opposite end of the scale and sought to embrace a life that purported detachment from all earthly ties. "I will have all or none," had been the inward cry of her bruised spirit. Fate had taken her at her word this time, and she had not been strong enough to endure, and had fled cowering from the consequence of her own act. Tortured, distraught, with self-confidence shattered to the earth, she had turned once again, with hands that trembled as they pleaded, to ask comfort of human love and companionship. Violet had not condemned her, had pitied her, and had shown her untiring sympathy and affection, for love of Cedric. Alex rose haggard in the morning. She wanted to be alone. The thought of going to Barbara in Hampstead had become unendurable to her. It was with a curious sense of inevitability that she found a letter from Barbara, asking her if she could put off her visit for the present. The admirable Ada had developed measles. "Good Lord, can't they send her to a hospital?" exclaimed Cedric, with the irritability of a practical man who finds his well-ordered and practical plans thrown out of gear by some eminently unpractical intervention on the part of Providence. "I am sure Barbara never would," said Violet, laughing. "Poor dear! I hope she won't catch it herself. It'll mean having the house disinfected too. What a nuisance for her! But Alex, dear, you must come with us. I'll send a wire today. Mother will be perfectly delighted." "Couldn't I stay here?" asked Alex. Cedric explained that the house would be partially shut up, with only 2 of the servants left. "I shouldn't give any trouble. I'd so much rather," Alex urged, unusually persistent. "My dear, it's out of the question. Not a soul in London. You forget it's August." "But Cedric," said Violet, "I don't see why she shouldn't do as she likes. It will be only till Barbara can have her after all. I suppose Ada will be moved as soon as she's better, and the disinfecting can't take so very long. If she wants to stay here?" "I do," said Alex with sudden boldness. "You don't think you'll be lonely?" "No, no." "After all," Violet considered, "it will be very good for Ellen and the tweenie to have somebody to wait upon. I never do like leaving them here on enormous board wages to do nothing at all, though Cedric will think it's the proper thing to do because his father did it." She laughed, and Cedric said with an air of concession, "Well, just till Barbara can take you in, perhaps, if you think London won't be unbearable. But mind you, Alex, the minute you get tired of it, or feel the heat too much for you, you're to make other arrangements." Alex wondered dully what other arrangements Cedric supposed that she could make. She had no money, and had never even roused herself to write the letter he had recommended, asking to have her half-yearly allowance sent to her own address and not to that of the Superior of the convent. But on the day before Cedric and Violet, with Violet's maid and Rosemary and her nurse and her pram, all took their departure, Cedric called Alex into the study. She went to him feeling oddly as though she was the little girl again, who had, on rare occasions, been sent for by Sir Francis, and had found him standing just so, his back to the fireplace, spectacles in hand, speaking in just the same measured, rather regretful tones of kindliness. "Alex, I've made out 2 cheques, one to cover the servants' board wages, which I thought you would be good enough to give them at the end of the month, and one for your own living expenses. You'd better cash that at once, in case you want any ready money. Have you anywhere to keep it under lock and key?" Cedric, no more than Sir Francis, trusted to a woman's discretion in matters of money. "Yes, there's the drawer of the writing table in my bedroom." "That will be all right, then. The servants are perfectly trustworthy, no doubt, but loose cash should never be left about in any case. If you want more, write to me. And Alex, I've seen old Pumphrey, father's man of business. He will see that you get your £50. Here's the first instalment." Cedric gravely handed her a 3rd cheque. "Have you a banking account?" "I don't think so." "Then I'll arrange to open one for you at my bank today. You'd better deposit this at once, hadn't you? Unless you want anything?" "No," faltered Alex, not altogether understanding. "You will have no expenses while you're here, of course," said Cedric, rather embarrassed. Alex looked bewildered. It had never occurred to her to suggest paying for her own keep while she remained alone at Clevedon Square. She gave back to her brother the cheque for £25 and received his assurance that it would be banked in her name that afternoon. "They will send you a cheque book, and you can draw out any small sum you may need later on." "I don't think I shall need any," said Alex, looking at the other 2 cheques he had given her, made payable to herself, and thinking what a lot of money they represented. "You will have a thorough rest and change with Barbara," Cedric said, still looking at her rather uneasily. "Then, when we meet again in October, it will be time enough—" He did not say what for, and Alex remembered the conversation that she had overheard on the stair. With a feeling of cunning, she was conscious of her own determination to take the initiative out of his hands without his knowledge. They did not want her, and they would want her less than ever with all the approaching business connected with Pamela's wedding in December. Barbara did not want her, self-absorbed and unwearingly considering how to cut down more and yet more expenses. Alex had made up her mind to go and live alone. She would prove to them that she could do it, though they thought £50 a year was so little money. She thought vaguely that perhaps she could earn something. But she gave no hint of her plans to anyone, knowing that Violet would be remonstrant and Cedric derisive. Obsessed by this new idea, she said good-bye to them with a sort of furtive eagerness, and found herself alone in the house in Clevedon Square. At first the quiet and the solitude were pleasant to her. She crept round the big, empty house like a spirit, feeling as though it presented a more familiar aspect with its shrouded furniture and carefully shaded windows, and the absence of most of Violet's expensive silver and china ornaments. The library, which was always kept open for her, was one of the least changed rooms in the house, and she spent hours crouched upon the sofa there, only rousing herself to go to the solitary meals which were punctiliously laid out for her in the big dining room. Presently she began to wonder if the elderly upper housemaid, Ellen, left in charge, resented her being there. She supposed that the presence of someone who never went out, for whom meals had to be provided, who must be called in the morning and supplied with hot water 4 times a day, would interfere with the liberty of Ellen and the unseen tweenie, who no doubt cooked for them. They would be glad when she went away. Never mind, she would go very soon. Alex felt that she was only waiting for something to happen which should give her the necessary impetus to carry out her vague design of finding a new, independent foothold for herself. A drowsy week of very hot weather slipped by, and then one morning Alex received 3 letters. Cedric's, short but affectionate, told her that Violet had reached Scotland tired out and had been ordered by the doctor to undergo something as nearly approaching a rest cure as possible. She was to stay in bed all the morning, sit in the garden when it was fine, and do nothing. She was to write no letters, but she sent Alex her love and looked forward to hearing from her. Cedric added briefly that Alex was not to be at all anxious. Violet only needed quiet and country air and no worries. She was looking better already. Alex put the letter down reflectively. Evidently Cedric did not want his wife disturbed by depressing correspondence, and she did not mean to write to Violet of her new resolution. She even thought that perhaps she would continue to let Violet believe her at Clevedon Square or with Barbara. Her second letter was from Barbara. It was quite a long letter, and said that Barbara had decided to leave Ada at a convalescent home and take her own much-needed summer holiday abroad. Would Alex join her in a week's time? "What do you think of some little cheap seaside hole in Brittany, which we could do for very little? I wish I could have you as my guest, dear, but you'll understand that all the disinfecting of the house has cost money, besides forcing me to go away, which I hadn't meant to do. However, I'm sure I need the change, and I dare say it won't do you any harm either. We ought to do the whole thing for about £15 each, I think, which I suppose will be all right for you. Do ring me up tonight and let's exchange views. I shan't be free of a suspicion as to these wretched measles till next week, but I don't think really there's much danger, as I've had them already, and am not in the least nervous. Ring up between 7 and 8 tonight. I suppose Violet, as usual, has kept on the telephone, even though they're away themselves?" Alex knew that she did not want to go abroad with Barbara. She nervously picked up the third letter, which bore a foreign postmark. When she had read the sheet of thin paper which was all the envelope contained, she sat for a long while staring at it. The nuns in Rome, with whom she had spent the few weeks previous to her return to England, had sent in their account for her board and lodging, for the few clothes she had purchased, and for the advance made her for her travelling expenses. The sum total in francs looked enormous. At last Alex, trembling, managed to arrive at the approximate amount in English money. £20! It seemed to her exorbitant, and she realised with fresh dismay that she had never taken such a debt into consideration at all. How could she tell Cedric? She thought how angry he would be at her strange omission in never mentioning it to him before, and how impossible it would be to explain to him that she had, as usual, left all practical issues out of account. Suddenly Alex remembered with enormous relief that £25 lay to her credit at the bank. She had received her new cheque-book only 2 days ago. She would go to the bank today and make them show her how she could send the money to Italy. Then Cedric and Violet need never know. They need never blame her. Full of relief, Alex took the cheque-book that morning to the bank. She did not like having to display her ignorance, but she showed the bill to the clerk, who was civil and helpful, and showed her how very simple a matter it was to draw a cheque for £20 odd. When it was done and safely posted, Alex trembled with thankfulness. It seemed to her that it would have been a terrible thing for Cedric to know of the expenses she had so ignorantly incurred, and of her incredible simplicity in never having realised them before. And she was glad that he need never know how almost the whole of her half-year's allowance of money had vanished so soon after she had received it. She telephoned to Barbara that night and said that she could not go abroad with her. "Oh, very well, my dear, if you think it wiser not. Of course, if you don't mind London at this time of year, it's a tremendous economy to stay where you are. Are the servants looking after you properly?" "Oh, yes." "Well, do just as you like, of course. I think I shall get hold of some friend to join forces with me, if you're sure you won't come." "Quite sure, Barbara," said Alex tremulously. She felt less afraid of her sister at the other end of the telephone. She went and saw Barbara off the following week, and Barbara said carelessly, "Good-bye, Alex. You look a shade better, I think. On the whole, you're wiser to stay where you are. I'm sure you need quiet, and when once the rush begins for Pam's wedding, you'll never get a minute's peace. Are you staying on when they get back?" "I'm not sure," faltered Alex. "You may be wise. Well, come down to my part of the world if you want economy, and to feel as though you were out of London. Good-bye, dear." Alex was surprised and rather consoled to hear Barbara alluding so lightly to the possibility of her seeking fresh quarters for herself. Perhaps, after all, they all thought it would be the best thing for her to do. Perhaps there was no need to feel guilty and as though her intentions must be concealed. But Alex, dreading blame or disapproval, or even assurances that the scheme was unpractical and foolish, continued to conceal it. She wrote and told Violet that she had decided that it would be too expensive to go abroad with Barbara. Might she stay on in Clevedon Square for a little while? But she had secretly made up her mind to go and look for rooms or a boarding house in Hampstead, as Barbara had suggested. As usual, it was only by chance that Alex realised the practical difficulties blocking her way. She had now only £5. On the following Saturday afternoon she found her way out by omnibus to Hampstead. She alighted before the terminus was reached, from a nervous dread of being taken on too far, although the streets in which she found herself were not prepossessing. For the first time Alex reflected that she had no definite idea as to where she wanted to go in her search for lodgings. She walked timidly along the road, which appeared to be interminably long and full of second-hand furniture shops. Bamboo tables and armchairs with defective casters were put out on the pavement in many instances, and there was often a small crowd in front of the window, gazing at the cheaply framed coloured supplements hung up within. The pavements and the roads, even the tram lines, swarmed with untidy, clamouring children. Alex supposed that she must be in the region vaguely known to her as the slums. Surely she could not live here? Then the recollection of her solitary £5 came to her with a pang of alarm. Of course she must live wherever she could do so most cheaply. She had no idea of what it would cost. It was very hot, and the pavement began to burn her feet. She did not dare to leave the main road, fearing that she would never find her way to the bus route again if once she left it, but she peeped down one or two side streets. They seemed quieter than Malden Road, but the unpretentious little grey houses did not look as though lodgers were expected in any of them. Alex wondered desperately how she was to find out. Presently she saw a policeman on the further side of the street. She went up to him and asked, "Can you tell me of anywhere near here where they let rooms, somewhere cheap?" The man looked down at her white, exhausted face, and at the well-cut coat and skirt chosen by Barbara, which yet hung loosely and badly on her stooping, shrunken figure. "Somebody's poor relation," was his unspoken comment. "Is it for yourself, miss? You'd hardly care to be in this neighbourhood, would you?" "I want to be somewhere near Hampstead, and somewhere very, very cheap," Alex faltered, thinking of her £5, which lay at that moment in the purse she was clasping. "Well, you'll find as cheap here as anywhere, if you don't mind the noise." "Oh, no," said Alex, who had never slept within the sound of traffic, surprised. "Then, if I was you, miss, I'd try number 252 Malden Road, just beyond the Gipsy Queen, that is, or else 2 doors further up. I saw cards up in both windows with apartments inside the last week." "Thank you," said Alex. She wished that Malden Road had looked more like Downshire Hill, which had trees and little tiny gardens in front of the houses, which almost all resembled country cottages. But no doubt houses in Downshire Hill did not let rooms, or if so they must be too expensive. Besides, Alex felt almost sure that Barbara would not want her as a very near neighbour. She was very tired when she reached number 252, and almost felt that she would take the rooms, whatever they were like, to save herself further search. After all, she could change later on if she did not like them. Like all weak people, Alex felt the urgent necessity of acting as quickly as possible on her own impulses. She looked distastefully at the dingy house, with its paint cracking into hard flakes, and raised the knocker slowly. A jagged end of protruding wire at the side of the door proclaimed that the bell was broken. Her timid knock was answered by a slatternly-looking young woman wearing an apron, whom Alex took to be the servant. "Can I see the landlady?" "Is it about a room? I'm Mrs. Hoxton." She spoke in the harshest possible Cockney, but quite pleasantly. "Oh," said Alex, still uncertain. "Yes, I want rooms, please." The woman looked her swiftly up and down. "Only one bed-sitting room vacant, miss, and that's at the top of the house. Would you care to see that?" "Yes, please." Mrs. Hoxton slammed the door and preceded Alex up a narrow staircase carpeted with oilcloth. On the 3rd floor she threw open the door of a room considerably smaller than the bathroom at Clevedon Square, containing a low iron bed and an iron tripod bearing an enamel basin, a chipped pitcher, and a very small towel rail. A looking-glass framed in mottled yellow plush was hung crookedly on the wall, and beneath it stood a wooden kitchen chair. There was a little table with 2 drawers in it behind the door. Alex looked round her with bewilderment. A convent cell was no smaller than this, and presented a greater aspect of space from its bareness. "Is there a sitting-room?" she inquired. "Not separate to this. No, miss. Bed-sitting room, this is called. Small, but then I suppose you'd be out all day." For a moment Alex wondered why. "But meals?" she asked feebly. "Would it be more than just a breakfast and supper and 3 meals on Sunday?" Alex did not know what to answer, and Mrs. Hoxton surveyed her. "Where are you working, miss? Anywhere near?" "I'm not working anywhere yet." Mrs. Hoxton's manner changed a little. "If you want 2 rooms, miss, and full board, I could accommodate you downstairs. The price is according, of course. A week in advance and pay by the week." Alex followed the woman downstairs again. She was sure that this was not the kind of place where she wanted to live. Mrs. Hoxton showed her into a larger bedroom on the 1st floor, just opening the door and giving Alex a glimpse of extreme untidiness and an unmade bed. "My gentleman got up late today. He don't go to his job Saturdays, so I haven't put the room to rights yet. But it's a nice room, miss, and will be vacant on Monday. It goes with the downstairs sitting room in the front as a rule, but that's had to be turned into a bedroom just lately. I've been so crowded." "Will that be empty on Monday too?" asked Alex for the sake of answering something. "Tonight, miss. I let a coloured gentleman have it. A student, you know. A thing I've never done before either. Other people don't like it, and it gives a name, like, for not being particular who one takes. So he's going, and I shan't be sorry. I don't hold with making talk, and it isn't as though the room wouldn't let easy. It's a beautiful room, miss." The coloured gentleman's room was tidier than the one upstairs, but a haze of stale tobacco fumes hung round it, and obscured Alex's view of a short leather sofa with horsehair breaking from it in patches, a small round table in the middle of the room, and a tightly closed window looking on to the traffic of Malden Road. "About terms, miss," Mrs. Hoxton began suggestively in the passage. "Oh, I couldn't afford much," Alex began, thinking that it was more difficult than she had supposed to walk out again, saying that she did not, after all, want the rooms. "I'd let you have those 2 rooms and full board for 2.10 a week," cried the landlady. "Oh, I don't think—" Mrs. Hoxton shrugged her shoulders, looked at the ceiling, and said resignedly, "Then I suppose we must call it 2 guineas, though I ought to ask double. But you can come in right away on Monday, miss, and I think you'll find it all comfortable." "But," said Alex faintly. She felt very tired, and the thought of a further search for lodgings wearied her and almost frightened her. Besides, the policeman had told her that this was a cheap neighbourhood. Perhaps anywhere else they would charge much more. Finally, she temporized feebly with the reflection that it need only be for a week. Once the step of leaving Clevedon Square had been definitely taken, she could feel herself free to find a more congenial habitation at her leisure, and when she might feel less desperately tired. She sighed as she followed the line of least resistance. "Well, I'll come on Monday, then." "Yes, miss," the landlady answered promptly. "May I have your name, miss? And the first week in advance my rule, as I think I mentioned." "My name is Miss Clare." Alex took 2 sovereigns and 2 shillings, fumbling, out of her purse and handed them to the woman. It did not occur to her to ask for any form of receipt. "Will you be wanting anything on Monday, miss?" Alex looked uncomprehending, and the woman eyed her with scarcely veiled contempt and added, "Supper or anything?" "Oh, yes. I'd better come in time for dinner. For supper, I mean." "Yes, miss. 7 o'clock will do you, I suppose?" Alex thought it sounded very early, but she did not feel that she cared at all, and said that 7 would do quite well. She wondered if there were any questions which she ought to ask, but could think of none, and she was rather afraid of the strident-voiced, hard-faced woman. But Mrs. Hoxton seemed to be quite satisfied, and pulled open the door as though it was obvious that the interview had come to an end. "Good afternoon," said Alex. "Afternoon," answered the landlady as she slammed the door again, almost before Alex was on the pavement of Malden Road. She went away with a strangely sinking heart. To what had she committed herself? All the arguments which Alex had been brooding over seemed to crumble away from her now that she had taken definite action. She repeated to herself again that Violet and Cedric did not want her, that Barbara did not want her, that there was no place for her anywhere, and that it was best for her to make her own arrangements and spare them all the necessity of viewing her in the light of a problem. But what would Cedric say to Malden Road? Inwardly, Alex resolved that he must never come there. If she said Hampstead, he would think that she was somewhere close to Barbara's pretty little house. But Barbara? Alex sank, utterly jaded, into the vacant space in a crowded omnibus. It was full outside, and the atmosphere of heat and humanity inside made her feel giddy. Arguments, self-justification, and sick apprehensions surged in chaotic bewilderment through her mind. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Embezzlement. Alex, full of unreasoning panic, made her move to Malden Road. She was afraid of the servants in Clevedon Square, all of them new since she had left England, and only told Ellen, with ill-concealed confusion, that she was leaving London for the present. She was unaccountably relieved when Ellen only said impassively, "Very good, miss," and packed her slender belongings without comment or question. Suddenly she remembered the cheque which Cedric had given her for the servants. She looked at it doubtfully. Her own money was already almost exhausted, thanks to that unexpected claim from the convent in Rome, and Alex supposed that the sum still in her purse, amounting to rather less than £3, would only last her for about a fortnight in Malden Road. She decided, with no sense of doubt, that she had better keep Cedric's cheque. It was only a little sum to him, and he would send money for the servants. He had said that he was ready to advance money to his sister. Characteristically, Alex dismissed the matter from her mind as unimportant. She had never learned any accepted code in dealings with money, and her own instinct led her to believe it an unessential question. She judged only from her own feelings, which would have remained quite unstirred by any emotions but those the most matter-of-fact at any claim, direct or indirect, justifiable or not, upon her purse. She had never learnt the rudiments of pride, or of straight dealing in questions of finance. But in Malden Road Alex was, after all, to learn many things. There were material considerations equally unknown to Clevedon Square and to the austere but systematic doling out of convent necessities, which were brought home to her with a startled sense of dismay from her first evening at 252. She had never thought of bringing soap with her, or boxes of matches, yet these commodities did not appear as a matter of course, as they had always done elsewhere. There was gas in both the rooms, but there were no candles. There was no hot water. "You can boil your own kettle on the gas ring on the landing," Mrs. Hoxton said indifferently, and left her new lodger to the realization that the purchase of a kettle had never occurred to her at all. Buying the kettle and a supply of candles and matches and soap left her with only just enough money in hand for her second week's rent, and when she wanted notepaper and ink and stamps to write to Barbara, Alex decided that she must appropriate Cedric's cheque for the servants' wages to her own uses. She felt hardly any qualms. This wasn't like that bill from Rome, which she would have been afraid to let him see. He would have talked about the dishonesty of convents, and asked why she had not told him sooner of their charges against her, and have looked at her with that almost incredulous expression of amazed disgust had she admitted her entire oblivion of the whole consideration. But this cheque for the servants, it would enable her to pay her own expenses until she could get the work which she still vaguely anticipated, and the sum meant nothing to Cedric. She would write and tell him that she had cashed the money, sure that he would not mind, in fulfilment of his many requests to her to look upon him as her banker. But she did not write, though she cashed the cheque. The days slipped by in a sort of monotonous discomfort, but it was very hot, and she learned to find her way to Hampstead Heath, where she could sit for hours, not reading, for she had no books, but brooding in a sort of despairing resignation over the past and the nightmare-seeming present. The conviction remained with her ineradicably that the whole thing was a dream, that she would wake up again to the London of the middle 90s, and find herself a young girl again, healthy and eager, and troubling Lady Isabel, and more remotely Sir Francis, with her modern exigencies and demands to live her own life, the war cry of those clamorous 80s and 90s, of which the young new century had so easily reaped the harvest. She could not bring herself to believe that her own life had been lived, and that only this was left. Alex sometimes felt that she was not alive at all, that she was only a shade moving amongst the living, unable to get into real communication with any of them. She did not think of the future. There was no future for her. There was only an irrevocable past and a sordid yet dreamlike present that clung round her spirit as a damp mist might have clung round her person, intangible and yet penetrating and all-pervading, hampering and stifling her. The modicum of physical strength which she had regained in Clevedon Square was ebbing imperceptibly from her. It was difficult to sleep very well in Malden Road, where the trams and the omnibuses passed in incessant, jerking succession, and the children screamed in the road late at nights and incredibly early in the mornings. The food was neither good nor well prepared, but Alex ate little in the heat, and reflected that it was an economy not to be hungry. The need for economy was being gradually borne in upon her as her small stock of money diminished and there came nothing to replace it. Presently she exerted herself to find a registry office, where she gave her name and address, and was contemptuously and suspiciously eyed by an old lady with dyed red hair, who sat at a writing-table and asked her for a fee of £0.50 for entering her name in a ledger. "No diplomas and no certificate won't take you far in teaching nowadays," she said unpleasantly. "Languages?" "French quite well, and a little Italian. Enough to give conversation lessons," Alex faltered. "No demand for 'em whatever. I'll let you know, but don't expect anything to turn up, especially at this time of year with everyone out of town." But by a miraculous stroke of fortune something did turn up. The woman from the registry office sent Alex a laconic postcard, giving her the address of "a lady singer in Camden Town," who was willing to pay 2 shillings an hour in return for sufficient instruction in Italian to enable her to sing Italian songs. Elated, Alex looked out the conversation manual of her convent days, and at 3 o'clock set out to find the address in Camden Town. She discovered it with difficulty and arrived late. The appointed hour had been 3:30. Shown into a small sitting room, crowded with furniture and plastered with signed photographs, she sank breathless and heated into a chair and waited. The lady singer, when she came, was irate at the delay. Her manner frightened Alex, who acquiesced in bewildered humiliation to a stipulation that only half fees must be charged for the curtailed hour. She gave her lesson badly, imparting information with a hesitation that even to her own ears sounded as though she were uncertain of her facts. However, her pupil ungraciously drew out a shilling from a small chain purse and gave it to Alex when she left, and she bade her come again in 3 days' time. The lessons went on for 3 weeks. They tired Alex strangely, but she felt glad that she could earn money, however little, and although the shillings went almost at once in small necessities, which she had somehow never foreseen, it was not until the middle of September that she began once more to reach the end of her resources. Just as she had decided that it would be necessary for her to write to Cedric, she received a letter from him forwarded from her bank. Alex turned white as she read it. My dear Alex, I am altogether at a loss to understand why Ellen, the upper housemaid at home, writes to Violet on Friday last, September the 12th, that you have left Clevedon Square, and that she and the other servant have not yet received the money for their board and wages. This last I take to be an oversight on your part, but you will doubtless put it right at once, since you will remember that I handed you a cheque for that purpose just before leaving London. As to your own movements, I need hardly say, my dear Alex, that I do not claim to have any sort of authority over them of whatever kind. But both Violet and I cannot help feeling that it would have been more friendly, to say the least of it, had you given us some hint as to your intentions. Knowing that Barbara is already abroad, and Pamela with her friends yachting, I can only hope that you have received some unforeseen invitation which appealed to you more than the prospect of solitude in Clevedon Square. It would have been desirable had you left your address with the servants, but I presume the matter escaped your memory, as they appear to be completely in the dark as to your movements. Violet is looking quite herself again and sends many affectionate messages. She will doubtless write to you on receipt of a few lines giving her your address. I am compelled to send this letter through the care of Messrs. Williams, which you will agree with me is an unnecessarily elaborate method of communication. Your affectionate brother, Cedric Clare. Alex was carried back through the years to the sense of remorse and bewilderment with which she had listened to the measured, irrefutable condemnations, expressed with the same unerring precision, of Sir Francis Clare. She realized herself again, sick with crying and cold with terror, standing shaking before his relentless justice, knowing herself to be again, for ever and hopelessly, in the wrong. She would never be anything else. She knew it now. Her sense of honour, of truth and justice, was perverted, in direct disaccord with that of the world. What would her brother say to her misuse of the money that he had entrusted to her? Alex knew now, with sudden, terrifying certainty, how he would view the transaction, which had seemed to her so simple and expedient. She knew that even were she able to make the almost incredible plea of a sudden temptation, a desperate need of money, that had led her voluntarily to commit an act of dishonesty, it would stand her in better stead than a mere statement of the terrible truth, that no voice within her had told her of dishonour, that she had, outrageous paradox, committed an act of dishonesty in good faith. To Cedric, the lack in her would seem so utterly perverted, so incomprehensible, that there would appear to be no possibility of that forgiveness which, as a Christian, he could consciously have extended to any wilful breaking of the law. But there would be no question of forgiveness for this. It was not the money, Alex knew that. It was her own extraordinary moral deficiency that put her outside the pale. Perhaps, thought Alex drearily, this was how criminals always felt. They did the things for which they were punished because of some flaw in their mental outlook. They didn't see that the things mattered until it was too late. They had to be saved from themselves by punishment or removal, or sometimes by death. And for the protection of the rest of the community too, it was necessary to penalise those who could not or would not conform to the standard. Alex saw it all. But dimly, involuntarily almost, an echo from her childhood's days came back to her, vaguely formulated into words. Always take the part of the people in the wrong. They need it most. The only conviction to which she could lay claim was somehow embodied in that sentiment. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cedric. She wrote to Cedric, the sense of having put herself irrevocably in the wrong by her own act, making her explanation into an utterly bald, lifeless statement of fact. She felt entirely unable to enter into any analysis of her folly, and besides, it would have been of no use. Facts were facts. She had taken Cedric's money, which he had given her for one purpose, and used it for another. There had not even been any violent struggle with temptation to palliate the act. Alex felt a sort of dazed stupefaction at herself. She was bad, she told herself, bad all through, and this was how bad people felt. Sick with disappointment and utterly unavailing remorse, knowing all the time that there was no strength in them ever to resist any temptation, however base. She wondered if there was a hell, as the convent teaching had so definitely told her. If so, Alex shudderingly contemplated her doom. But she prayed desperately that there might be nothing after death but utter oblivion. It was then that the thought of death first came to her, not with the wild, impotent longing of her days of struggle, but with an insidious suggestion of rest and escape. She played with the idea, but for the most part her faculties were absorbed in the increasing strain of waiting for Cedric's reply to her confession. It came in the shape of a telegram. "Shall be in London, Wednesday 24th. Will you lunch Clevedon Square 1:30? Reply paid." Alex felt an unreasonable relief, both at the postponement of an immediate crisis and at the reflection that, at all events, Cedric did not mean to come to Malden Road. She did not want him to see those strange, sordid surroundings to which he had fled from the shelter of her old home. Alex telegraphed an affirmative reply to her brother, and waited in growing apathy for the interview, which she could now only dread in theory. Her sense of feeling seemed numbed at last. Something of the old terror, however, revived when she confronted Cedric again in the library. He greeted her with a sort of kindly seriousness, under which she wonderingly detected a certain nervousness. During lunch they spoke of Violet, of the shooting that Cedric had been enjoying in Scotland. The slight shade of pomposity which recalled Sir Francis was always discernible in all Cedric's kindly courtesy as host. After lunch he rather ceremoniously ushered his sister into the library again. "Sit down, my dear, you look tired. You don't smoke, I know. Do you mind if I—" He drew at his pipe once or twice, then carefully rammed the tobacco more tightly into the bowl with a nicotine-stained finger. Still gazing at the wedged black mass, he said in a voice of careful unconcern, "About this move of yours, Alex, Violet and I couldn't altogether understand. That's really what brought me down, and the question of that cheque I gave you for the servants. I couldn't quite make out your letter." He paused, as though to give her an opportunity for speech, still looking away from her. But Alex remained silent in a sort of paralysis. "Suppose we take one question at a time," suggested Cedric pleasantly. "The cheque affair is of course a very small one and quite easily cleared up. One only has to be scrupulous in money matters because they are money matters. You know father's way of thinking, and I must say I entirely share it." There was no need to tell Alex so. "Have you got the cheque with you, Alex?" "No," said Alex at last. "Didn't you understand my letter, then?" Cedric's spectacles began to tap slowly against the back of his left hand, held in the loose grasp of his right. "You cashed that cheque?" "Yes." Alex felt as though she were being put to the torture of the Inquisition, but was utterly unable to do more than reply in monosyllables to Cedric's level, judicial questions. "May I ask to what purpose you applied the money?" "Cedric, it's not fair," broke from Alex. "I've written and told you what I did. I needed money, and I thought you wouldn't mind. I used it for myself, and I meant to write and tell you." You thought I wouldn't mind? Repeated Cedric in tones of stupefaction. You said you would advance me money. I knew you could write another cheque for the servants' wages. I didn't think of your minding. Mind? Said Cedric again, with reiteration worthy of his nursery days. My dear girl, you don't suppose it's the money I mind, do you? No, I ought to have asked you first, but I didn't think. It seemed a natural thing to do. Good Lord, Alex, cried Cedric, more moved than she had ever seen him. Do you understand what you're saying? A natural thing to do to embezzle money? Tears of terror and of utter bewilderment seized on Alex's enfeebled powers and deprived her of utterance. Cedric began to pace the library, speaking rapidly and without looking at her. If you'd only written and told me what you'd done at once, though heaven knows that would have been bad enough, but to do a thing like that and then let it rest, didn't you know that it must be found out sooner or later? He cast a fleeting glance at Alex, who sat with the tears pouring down her quivering face, but she said nothing. It was of no use to explain to Cedric that she had never thought of not being found out. She had meant no concealment. She had thought her action so simple a one that it had hardly needed explanation or justification. It had merely been not worth while to write. Cedric's voice went on, gradually gaining in power as the agitation that had shaken him subsided under his own fluency. You know that it's a prosecutable offence, Alex. Of course there's no question of such a thing, but to trade on that certainty. Alex made an inarticulate sound. Violet says of course you didn't know what you were doing. That wretched place, that convent, has played havoc with you altogether. When I think of those people. Cedric's face darkened. But hang it, Alex, you were brought up like the rest of us, and on a question of honour. Think of father. Alex had stopped crying. She was about to make her last stand, with the last strength that in her lay. Cedric, listen to me. You must. You don't understand. I didn't look at it from your point of view. I didn't see it like that. There's something wrong with me. There must be. But it didn't seem to me to matter. I know you won't believe me, but I thought the money was quite a little unimportant thing, and that you'd understand and say I'd done right to take it for granted that I might have it. But it's not the money, groaned Cedric. Though what on earth you wanted it for when you had no expenses and your allowance just paid in. But that's not the point. Can't you see, Alex, it's not this wretched cheque in itself. It's the principle of the thing. Alex gazed at him quite hopelessly. The flickering spark of spirit died out and left her soul in darkness. Cedric faced her. I couldn't believe that your letter really meant what it seemed to mean, he said slowly. But if it does, as on your own showing it does, then I understand your leaving us, needless to say. Where are you living? What is this place, Malden Road? Characteristically, he drew out her letter and referred to the address carefully. Where is Malden Road? In Hampstead, near Barbara. Are you in rooms? Yes. How did you find them? Who recommended them? She made no answer, and Cedric gazed at her with an expression of half angry, half compassionate perplexity. You are entitled to keep your own counsel, of course, and to make your own arrangements, but I must say, Alex, that the thought of you disturbs me very much. Your whole position is unusual, and your attitude makes it almost impossible to—" He broke off. Violet begged me, quite unnecessarily, but you know what she is, not to let you feel as though there were any estrangement, to say that whatever arrangement you preferred should be made. Of course, Pamela's marriage will add to your resources. You understand that? She's marrying an extremely wealthy man, and I shall have not the slightest hesitation in allowing her to make over the share of father's money to you as soon as it can be arranged. She wishes it herself. He paused, as though for some expression of gratitude from Alex, but she made none. Pam had everything, and now she was to have the credit and pleasure of a generosity which would cost her nothing as well. Alex maintained a bitter silence. The obvious course is for you to join Barbara, paying your half of expenses, as you will now be able to do. Barbara doesn't want me. It's the natural arrangement, repeated Cedric inflexibly. And I must add, Alex, that you seem to me to be terribly unfitted to manage your own life in any way. If what you've told me is the case, I can only infer that your moral sense is completely perverted. I couldn't have believed it of one of us, of one of my father's children." Alex knew that the bedrock of Cedric's character was reached. She had come to the point where for Cedric right and wrong began and ended. Honour. They would never get any nearer to one another now. The fundamental principle which governed life for Cedric was deficient in Alex. She got up slowly and began to pull on her shabby gloves. "Will you forgive me, Cedric?" she half sobbed. "It isn't a question of forgiveness. Of course I will. But if you'd only asked me for that wretched money, Alex. What you did was to embezzle it, neither more nor less. Oh, good Lord!" He looked at her with fresh despair and then rang the bell. "You're going to have a taxi," he told her authoritatively. "You're not fit to go any other way. Alex, my dear, I'd give my right hand for this not to have happened. For heaven's sake, come to me if you want anything. How much shall I give you now?" He unlocked the writing-table drawer agitatedly. Alex thought to herself hysterically, "He thinks I may steal money, perhaps from somebody else, if I want it, and perhaps I should." And with a sense of degradation that made her feel physically sick, she put into her purse the gold and the pile of silver that he pushed into her hand. Cedric straightened himself, and taking off his glasses, wiped them carefully. "Write to me, Alex, and let me know what you want to do. Barbara will be back soon. You must go to her, at any rate for a time, till after Pamela's wedding. You know that's fixed for December now? And, my dear, for heaven's sake, let's forget this ghastly business. No one on this earth but you and I and Violet need ever know of it." "No," said Alex. She looked at him with despair invading her whole being. "Good-bye, Cedric. You've been very, very kind to me." "The taxi's at the door, sir." "Thank you." Cedric took his sister into the hall, and she gave a curious, fleeting glance round her at the familiar surroundings, and at the broad staircase where the Clare children had run up and down and played and quarrelled together in that other existence. "Good-bye, dear. Write your plans and come and see us as soon as we get back. It won't be more than a week or two now." Cedric put her into the waiting taxi, and stood on the steps looking after her as the cab turned out of Clevedon Square. And Alex, crouched into a corner of the swiftly moving taxi, knew herself capable of any treachery, any moral infamy to which she might be tempted, since Cedric had been right when he said that her sense of honour, of fundamental rectitude, was completely perverted. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Forgiveness. The weather broke suddenly, and it became cold and rainy. For 2 or 3 days Alex sat in her sitting-room at Malden Road, and heard the trams and the omnibuses clash past, and the children screaming to one another in the street. She could hardly have said when she had first realized that it was impossible for her to go on living, but the determination, now that it was there, full grown, had brought with it a sense of utter finality. For 2 or 3 days she felt stunned, and yet driven by a desperate feeling that it was necessary for her to think, to make a plan. But she could not think. Then one evening Mrs. Hoxton, the landlady, said to her curiously, "Wouldn't you like a fire tonight?" She seldom said "miss" in speaking to Alex. "It's so chilly all of a sudden, and you look ill, really, now, you do." Alex felt rather surprised. Perhaps she was ill, which would account for the impossibility of consecutive thought. A fire would be very nice. She shivered involuntarily, looking at her little empty grate crammed with cut paper. She remembered that there was no need to consider expense any more. "Yes, I'd like a fire, please," she said gently. And that evening she sat close to the pleasant blaze flickering on the wall, and dimly recalling to her the nursery at Clevedon Square in the old days, and the power of thought came back to her. It was as though the warmth and companionship of the flames had suddenly unsealed something frozen up within her, and she became more herself than she had been for many months. With the horrible pressing dread of an unbearable present and an unimaginable future lifted from her heart, Alex felt a pervading lucidity of thought, to which she had for years been a stranger, take possession of her. She knew suddenly that she was, for a little while, to regain faculties that had been atrophied within her since the far, free days of her girlhood. She began to reflect. Why had life, to which she had looked forward so eagerly, with such confident anticipation of some wonderful happiness which should be in proportion to the immense capacity for realizing it which she knew to exist within her, have proved to be only a succession of defeats, of receding hopes, and of unfulfilled desires? Alex did not question that the fault lay with herself. From her baby days, under the unvarnished plain speaking of old nurse, she had known herself to be the black sheep of every flock. And she had not sinned splendidly, dramatically either. Her sins had been those of petty meanness, of shirking and evading, of small self-indulgences and childish tyranny at the expense of others, of vulgar lies and half-truths. Those sins which find little or no place in the Decalogue, and which stand lowest in the scale by which the opinion of others is meted out to us. Those are the things which are not forgiven. That was it, Alex told herself, with a feeling of having suddenly struck the keynote. Forgiveness. Forgiveness was the key to everything. Alex, in the sudden surety of vision that had come to her, did not doubt that her own interpretation of the word was the right one. Forgiveness meant understanding, not condemnation and subsequent pardon. It did not mean the bewildered, scandalized, and yet regretful oblivion to which Cedric would consign her memory and that of her many failings. It did not mean Barbara's detached, indifferent kindness, carefully measured in terms of material resources, nor Pamela's and Archie's good-natured patronage, half stifled in mirth, of which the very object was the gulf that separated them from their sister. It did not even mean Violet's soft pity and unresentful acceptance of facts that amazed her. Looking further back, Alex knew that it did not mean either the serious, perplexed pardon that Sir Francis had tendered to his troublesome daughter, or Lady Isabel's half-complaining, half-affectionate remonstrances. It did not in any way occur to her to blame them for a lack of which she had all her life been subconsciously aware in all their forbearance. She told herself with a fresh sense of enlightenment that they had not understood because it was in none of them to have yielded to those temptations which had beset and mastered her so easily. Measuring her frailty by their own strength, they had only seen her utter failure in resistance, and had been shamed and grieved by it. Alex knew that in herself was another standard of forgiveness. She could never condemn, for the simple reason that she herself had failed in every sense of the word. Unresentfully, she was able to sum it all up, as it were, when she told herself, people who would have resisted temptation themselves can't understand those who fall, so they can't really forgive. But the bad ones, who know that they have given way all along the line, know that any temptation would have been too strong for them. It's only chance whether it comes their way or not, so they can understand. She felt oddly contented, as at having reached a solution. Later on, her thoughts turned to the past again, and to the childish days when she had been the leading spirit in the Clevedon Square nursery. But the memory of that past, incredible security and assurance, made her begin to cry. And she wiped away blinding tears and told herself that she must not give way to them. She did not at first quite know why she must reserve the tiny modicum of strength still left her, but presently she realized that the end which had become inevitable could not be reached without decisive action of her own. Alex's logic was elementary, and its directness left her no loophole for doubt. She could endure the plane of existence on which she found herself no longer. If she fled in search of other conditions, it was with full certainty that these could not be less tolerable than those from which she was flying. And at the back of her mind was a strange, growing hope that perhaps that forgiveness of which her mind was full might be found beyond the veil. After all, thought Alex, it's even chances. If religion is all true, then I must go to hell whether I kill myself or not. And if it isn't, then perhaps I shall just go out and know nothing more, ever. Or perhaps it will be really a new beginning, and there will be somebody or something who will forgive me and let me start over again. She began to feel rather excited, as though she were about to try an experiment that might best be described as a gamble. Mrs. Hoxton, coming in with a small supper tray, looked at her sharply 2 or 3 times, and when she had gone away again, Alex, turning to the glass, saw that her eyes were shining, and looking enormously large and wide-pupilled. "I believe I'm happy tonight," she thought wonderingly. While she ate her supper she tried to make a plan, but the excitement within her was growing steadily, and she could only think out eager self-justification for her own decision. "It won't hurt anyone else, nobody will mind. In fact, when they've got over the first shock, it will be a relief to them all. They've been very kind, Violet and Cedric, Violet most of all, but they haven't understood. They'd have understood better if I'd been a bad woman, lived with wicked men, or things like that. I suppose I should have done that too if it had come my way, but then I never had the temptation. I had only little, mean, horrible temptations, and I didn't resist any of them. The other sort of sin would have made me happier. It would have meant a sort of success in a way. But I've been a failure at everything, always." Her heart hammering against her side, Alex resolved that in this, her last disgrace, she would not fail. Making no preparations, no written farewells, she rose presently and went to her room, where she put on her thickest coat and tied a woollen scarf over her head. Then she went out. It had stopped raining, and the air was soft and moist. It was a starless night, and when Alex got to the heath and away from the lighted streets, it was very dark. Underneath her sense of adventure she was conscious of terror, sheer physical terror, and also of the deeper dread that her resolution might fail her. "I mustn't, I mustn't," she kept on muttering to herself. Then, as though reassuring somebody else, "But it's only like going for a journey, to a quite new place, where everything may be different and much, much better, or else to sleep, and never any waking up to misery again. Just one dreadful minute or two perhaps, and then it will all be over. Only a question of a little physical courage, not to struggle, like taking gas, much easier if one doesn't struggle." She was struck by a sudden thought, and said aloud triumphantly, as though she were defeating by her inspiration someone who was urging difficulties upon her, "I won't give myself any chances. I'll put big stones in my pocket and tie my scarf over my mouth. That'll make it quicker too." When she came to the part of the heath where the water lay, Alex began to stoop down and hunt for stones. She pounced on each one that seemed larger than its fellows with a sense of pride at her own success, and put them into the pockets of her coat. The moon appeared palely through clouds, and then disappeared again, but not before she had taken her bearings. She was on one of the many wide bridges that span the long pools dotted over the heath, pools shelving at the sides with an effect of shallowness and deepening suddenly in the middle. Alex threw an indifferent glance at the dark water, and only felt annoyance that so few stones should be loose upon the pathway, and none of them very large ones. When her pockets were filled, she did not think the weight very noticeable. Then came another evanescent gleam of moonlight, and Alex, still with that sharpening of all her perceptions, noticed that there was a man's figure at the far end of the bridge. He appeared to be stationary, leaning on the parapet and gazing down at the almost invisible pond. She was conscious of vexation. His presence would surely interfere with her scheme. For a moment she wondered, detachedly enough, whether she should go away and come back the following evening. But the next instant she recoiled from the thought, as though seeing in it the promptings of her own weakness. "I'm not frightened tonight, at least hardly at all. If I wait I may never feel like this again. I shall make a failure of it all, and that would be worse than anything. I must do it tonight while I'm not frightened." She was not cold. Walking in her heavy coat had warmed her, and the evening was mild as well as damp. So she waited quietly in the shadow, hoping that the man would presently move away. The thought crossed her mind with a certain humour that the situation held possibilities of romance. If it were in a book, he would save me at the last minute and fall in love with me, and it would all end happily. Or he would see me now and perhaps speak to me, and he would understand all I told him and persuade me not to. Anyhow, it would all come right. She smiled in the darkness. But that won't happen to me. There never was any one, and nobody would love me now, especially when they knew all about me. She remembered the haggard, distorted countenance that the looking-glass had shown her, the great starting eyes with discoloured circles beneath them, and the blackened, prominent teeth, more salient than ever from the thinness of her face. She could almost have laughed, without any conscious bitterness, at the idea of any romance in connection with her present self. And yet the girl Alex Clare could have loved, had looked forward to love and to happiness as her rights, just as Pamela Clare did now. But Pamela was different. Every one was. No, it was Alex that was different, that had always been different. She began to feel less warm and shivered a little as she waited. It occurred to her, not with any sense of fear, but with vexation, that her purpose would be far more difficult of achievement if she waited until she was physically chilled. She looked up at the bridge again, and the figure was still there, at the furthest end. Alex measured the length of the bridge with her eyes. It was doubtful if he would see her from the furthest end of it, but she reflected matter-of-factly, if I jump there will be the noise of a splash, and he might do something. He would try to save me, I suppose, or run for help. It wouldn't be safe. If he would only go. She became irritated. With a sense of despair, she determined to circumvent the motionless, watchful figure. Moving very quietly and almost soundlessly over the soft, muddy ground, Alex made her way from the path to the bank, and further down it, till only a short declivity of shelving mud lay between her and the water. She could feel the brambles catching in her thick coat, as though pulling her back, but she went on, cautiously and steadily. Once or twice she pushed at the low, tangled bushes that impeded her progress, and paused aghast at the rustling that ensued. But from the bridge above her there came no sound. Within a few steps of the dark water, her feet already sinking ankle-deep into the wet, spongy ground, she stopped. She realized with wondering joy that after all she was not very much afraid. It was as though the self-confidence which had for so long deserted her had come back now to carry her through the last need. She felt proud, because she knew that for this once she was not going to fail. She talked to herself in a whisper. This one time, just a few minutes when it may be very bad, but remember that it can't last long and then it'll all be over. And perhaps there'll never be anything more afterwards, like being always asleep, and no one need be vexed or disappointed any more. But perhaps. She paused on the thought, and her heart began to beat faster with a hopeful excitement such as she had not known for a very long while. Perhaps it will be much better than one imagines possible. Perhaps there'll be real forgiveness and understanding, and then my having done this won't matter. Anyway, I shall know very soon, if only I'm brave just for a few minutes. She drew a long breath, then instinctively stretching her arms straight out before her so as to balance herself, she began to move forward. The first unmistakable touch of the water round her feet made her gasp and stifle a scream, but she waded on, encouraging herself in a low murmur as though speaking to a child. It's only like going into the sea when one's bathing. Pretend it's that, then you won't be frightened. Just straight on. It will be over quite soon. She was moving slowly but without pause, her hands held out in front of her, the ground still beneath her slipping feet, which felt oddly weighted. Once she began to pull the woollen scarf over her mouth, but with the sense of breathlessness came the beginning of panic, and she tore it away again. Go on! Coward! Coward! She urged herself. Remember what it would mean to make another muddle of this and to fail. The cold invaded her body and her teeth began to chatter. For an instant she stood, surrounded by the silent water, cold and terror and the weight of her now sodden clothing paralysing her, so that she could not move, neither backwards to the shore, nor forward into the blackness in front of her. I must, muttered Alex, and wrenched one foot desperately out of the mud below. With the forward movement she lost her balance, and her hands clutched instinctively at the water's level. Then the clogging bottom of the pond sheared away suddenly from beneath her, and there was only water, dark and icy and rushing, above and below and all around her. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Consequences by E.M. Delafield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Epitaph. They sat round, afterwards, in the Clevedon Square drawing-room, all the people who had helped misguided, erring Alex, according to their lights, or again according to their limitations, and who had failed her so completely in the ultimate essential. Pamela and her lover whispered together in the window. "After all, you know," hesitated the girl, She had nothing much to live for, poor Alex. She'd got out of touch with all of us, and she had no one of her very own. Not like us." His hand closed for an instant over hers. "There was no reason why she should not have come to us if she was in money difficulties," reiterated Cedric uneasily. He consciously refrained from adding "again." Violet was crying softly, lying back in the depths of a great arm-chair. "Poor Alex! I never guessed Malden Road was like that. Why did she go there? Oh, poor Alex!" "You were nicer to her than any of us, Violet," said Archie gruffly. "She was awfully fond of you, wasn't she? And of the little kid?" Barbara, hard and self-contained, gazed round the familiar room. For a moment it seemed to her that they were all children again, sent down from the nursery by old Nurse on Lady Isabel's at-home afternoon. Her eyes met those of Cedric, who had taken up his stand against the mantelpiece, in his hand his glasses, which he was shaking with little judicial jerks. "Oh, Cedric," said Barbara with a sudden catch in her voice, "don't you remember? Alex was such a pretty little girl." End of chapter 30. End of Consequences by E. M. Delafield.